Only being a rookie on the search and rescue, I was deeply disturbed by my findings. I was assigned to the crime scene, where I had found a dismembered body, abandoned by the side of the road. Nevertheless, I was grateful for any experiences that would help me grow as a wildlife officer, and I knew that this experience would provide excellent training opportunities. The victim's head and limbs were all scattered across several yards from each other. Due to this fact, we were able to determine the animal responsible very easily. Our clues came in our general surroundings. Pieces of clothing or belongings are usually left behind after an attack, due to fear of being identified, as in cases with humans as well. The one huge drawback to this was the further we investigated, it didn't match any known killing of any local wildlife we knew. Usually, we were able to identify teeth and bite marks, scratches and claw marks. There might be fur of an actual animal here that we tested, but not making any sense. Nothing came up as a match in our vast systems. No one could identify the clump of orange-looking matted fur that was left by the victim's head. Worst of the matter, it almost looked as if the head and limbs had been ripped from the body. Not mauled or torn with teeth or claws. Ripped, using brute strength. Now you tell me, what the hell kind of animal would be able to do that? Once the police and medical examiner came, removing the body and any evidence, we were able to further explore the area. Since I was only a rookie, I had to tag along with one of the older guys, and to be honest, I was okay with that. I wasn't sure I was going to get the sight of that body out of my mind for a long time. The boss told him we had to check the area. Until that point, I didn't even know we split the area by letters, and before I could even glean any more information, we were off. I noticed my buddy had made sure the rifle was loaded and ready before we ever headed off. We drove around for a bit, taking the truck through the woods and hiking trail until we got to a far denser part of the parkland that I had never been to before. The ranger just sat there with the engine idling for a bit, looking into the trees in front of us, which were way too close together to drive through. It was weird, but I would have sworn there was something like fear in his eyes. "This is as far as I go," he told me. "Not only because the truck can't get through, but we don't belong out there." Of course, I had to ask what he meant by that. So I asked him, "What do you mean don't belong? Rangers can't go. Is it private land?" He looked at me and replied real seriously that people can't go in there, and it wasn't just exclusive to rangers. I wanted to ask more, but his silence seemed to imply that that was the end of the conversation, at least for now. And although it seemed to be a real odd thing to say, I didn't think too much of it. Not right then, anyway. We drove back to the ranger station, having scouted the area and not seen anything else suspicious, or indeed anything else at all. There didn't seem to be a deer, rabbit, or even a bird in sight. There was a strange atmosphere back at the station too. Even though I was still quite new, they'd always treated me as a part of the team, keen and eager to take me under their wing, to help me learn the ropes. I'd been told many stories, and most of them had humorous anecdotes about various findings and when they'd done something silly, which they could laugh about after. But this was different. They didn't seem to want to include me. There were lots of looks passed between them, as if there was something they all knew except me, and I couldn't work out what was going on. In the end, still feeling jittery from the gory discovery, and the fact that no one seemed to know what the hell kind of creature had caused such devastation, I yelled out, "So, what's with all this secret-looking stuff not going into the woods? I mean, what do you think is out here? A Bigfoot? A Wendigo? Don't tell me. There's a UFO hotspot, right?" The room had gone silent, with the boss beckoning over me to his desk. I wasn't sure if I was going to get reprimanded, but he unlocked his drawer and pulled out a map and some various case files. Over the next hour or so, he and the others told me about different incidents they'd attended to over the years. Discoveries that they'd made that either hadn't ended up on the official system or had been closed with a fake clarification. The category they were really filed under was unexplained. Looking in the files into the photos, a lot of the bodies were in a similar state to the victim I'd found. Head and limbs torn from the torso, but despite numerous bite marks on the body, fur and feces found nearby, they could not match the animal with anything they'd come across before. Of course, even though I'd grown up reading Goosebumps and watching Supernatural, I didn't actually believe in anything unexplained. That notion was ridiculous. Must be some sort of hybrid predator, like a wolf and a cougar had somehow produced offspring. No, the boss had told me. The DNA blood tested at the scene had no similarities with any other animal, except one, he had told me. He pulled out a sheet of paper from the file, and the printout from the blood found today. It was a match, so the same creature had attacked the latest victim and the person in this older file. Maybe all the files. Then I noticed the anomaly. The one creature it had something in common with. Human. So I asked if a person did this. But it couldn't be. If they really thought it was a person, a human being responsible, why were they looking into it and not the police? I mean, why not the FBI, if there were this many blatant cases? But he told me it wasn't a person, and the DNA says it was definitely not a human, but maybe at some point it was. I can't even really explain how that made me feel, or what I was thinking. It did go through my mind that maybe this was some sort of elaborate prank or initiation, that someone would shout, "Gotcha!" But it never came. Needless to say, the case was closed very fast. I'm guessing the file ended up locked in a drawer along with the others. For the next few weeks, we all had to double up when we went out, especially if it was dark or we were headed off the paths. Kept the camp and trails shut to the public too. And I still haven't seen a deer or even a rabbit, although the birds seem to be back. There's something out there for sure, but for now, it remains unexplained. My search and rescue experience is not specific to a park, rangers, or even one emergency service. I have been fortunate enough to be exposed to many different situations all throughout my short career. The following are quick stories about some of those incidents. I've only been a ranger now for 2 years, and before that, I spent another 5 years in the military as an infantryman. All that I know is combat, but working with civilians has taught me valuable lessons on how to take charge. Like how I now wish we had increased the search area on this case a lot sooner, and before the weather had changed. It's the weirdest and most frightening experience I've ever had, despite seeing action in the army, because there's never been a rational explanation for what happened to those women. The 3 ladies in question were hiking along a well-traveled trail up to Mount Rainier when they went missing. On the 5th day, it started snowing very hard, and there was no sign of them anywhere. One of their boyfriends had called in, claiming the women were all young, fit and healthy, most importantly. Experienced hikers, even if the weather had taken a most unexpected turn. There was no GPS or cell phone activity from any of them, and hadn't been since the 2nd day. If it had been snowing the entire time, I would have to be more inclined to expect to find 3 frozen bodies, but the snow had only just begun. Albeit that now the snow had added to the problem. It should not have been the cause. I headed up to the last place one of them had used to call, and we located the GPS signal, then followed the trail myself until I reached their intended finish and rendezvous. There was indeed no sign or anything, the snow now covering any tracks I might have been able to spot. I spent that entire day exploring the area as much as the weather would allow me to, checking above me the whole time. You'd be surprised how many clues there are in the trees that regular people might miss. But no, I couldn't find a thing. It was like those three women just found a hole in the ground and were sucked in. Snow had continued to fall for the next 4 days solid, and we gave up much hope ever finding them alive. Even if they had managed to crawl into some space that I didn't know existed, they'd have likely have frozen to death by now anyway. On the 4th day, so now 9 days since they were supposed to have finished the trail, the weather now grew warmer, and snow began to melt some. So I headed back out, taking one of the dogs with me this time that I had borrowed for the job. See, Old Shep was a cadaver dog, trained to sniff out corpses. As I said, I wasn't expecting to find any of those ladies alive. I'm sure you already figured out this story won't have a happy ending. First off, Old Shep did find something like what I'd been expecting. A leg. One cleanly amputated left leg. No boot or clothing. Just the leg. A leg that, aside from no longer being clothed or attached to its owner, was perfectly fine. Not bruised, not gashed, no bite marks. Then, we found one of the women, just walking on the trail. I immediately called for an airlift, covering her in warm blankets, giving her fluids. She was still fully dressed in her hiking clothes. No visible cuts, bruises, although you could tell from looking at her, she was in shock, suffering from hypothermia, and appeared to be starving. Her pack and cell were missing, despite me trying to find out if she knew where the others were. She was unable or unwilling to talk. Once at the hospital, they checked over her but couldn't find any physical or long-term injuries or issues. No frostbite, no flesh wounds, nothing. As soon as she was warm and had eaten, she was asked a ton of questions, but nothing. She spent months in the hospital, just recovering. Having been moved onto the psych ward pretty early to my knowledge, was barely able to communicate at all, let alone give an explanation. We never found any more of the second woman, other than that leg, and nothing at all of the third woman, nor their packs or cells or any belongings. It just disappeared. But the scariest part, the part that makes no sense, even less sense than 3 fit and healthy women going out onto a well-used trail and only one coming back, is that this is not the first occurrence of a group of people just disappearing, and only one returning without a scratch or mark on them. But no one has any reasonable explanation as to what could be the cause. I used to be a park ranger for Yellowstone National Park. I was walking along the small boardwalk when I came to an overlook where I could see a herd of buffalo grazing in the distance, and some of them had wandered off into the trees where it was more difficult to see. As I was watching, one jumped out from behind a tree and ran away, back into the forest. I noticed right then that they were being hunted by something. Out of the woodline, I saw this large canine-type animal, except it wasn't a canine. At least, not your typical canine. It was walking on its hind legs, just like a person, but it was holding onto the tree, using its momentum to propel itself towards the bison that had just went into the tree. As I watched, in my mind, I was like, that's not real. That did not just happen. In less than 10 seconds, it had killed the bison, dragging its carcass off behind a large boulder further into the woodline. As soon as the body was out of sight, a group of these wolves moved out from where they were hiding inside the trees began moving towards the carcass. There must have been at least 10 of them, but they were more than popping out from behind the trees and bushes where they had been hiding. These were wolves like I had never seen before. I had never heard in my life of wolves that were able to stand on their hind legs. Not like these. This was something else entirely. I don't know how many of these types of creatures were in the park, nor do I know where they originated from. No animal have I ever seen looks like these creatures do. They quickly began grouping back into formation, moving towards the other bison. I got scared and began making my way back to headquarters very quickly. The last thing I saw was them surrounding the remaining bison, killing them. I will never forget what I saw that day in Yellowstone, nor do I want to ever see it again. This was back in 1989. Now that the information is much more available to all of us online, I've learned that these creatures that I've seen are actually referred to as Dogman. They've been documented in all different parts of the world for centuries. These things are apparently nocturnal, using whatever shadows are available to be able to sneak up on their prey just before attacking. There's a lot more information out there too, but I'm afraid that it just might get me killed if people knew that I knew about these things. What's shocking is these things were hunting in the evening, not dark at all. And the angle I was watching them at, they were completely visible from where I was. Before you go off and start asking questions, please know that I have not seen the Dogman since 1989. As far as I know, they are not in Yellowstone anymore. At least I hope not. I'm not afraid to admit that these things exist. I have seen them with my own 2 eyes. Unless someone can explain what it is that I saw all those years ago, I'm not the only one. I chose to share this because it is real. People need to be aware what's out there. If you choose not to believe me, then fine. But please do your research before making a decision on it. It's very important that we understand these things a lot better than I do. I used to be a search and rescue officer, also working as a ranger. I've seen some very disturbing things out here in these parks, but never anything like this. It's been exactly 10 years since the following events occurred. This summer that I ran into what I've dubbed a Dogman. I was working in a very well-known park. I won't say which. At the time, I'd been in the service for 3 years, and this was my first real summer out on my own by myself. It was pretty intimidating, but I loved it. The first night that I had any contact with what would become known as the Dogman to me and my crew. We had just finished up our search for the day, and were heading back to camp. I was at the front of the line walking when I saw something out of the corner of my eye on one of those long boulder fields that are scattered all throughout. I immediately stopped and began looking around, trying to see what it was that I had seen, but there was nothing. Just trees and bushes all around. I thought, man, I'm tired, but that looked like a wolf. I might have had some kind of spooked expression because one of my other guys asked me what was wrong. I told him what I saw. He told me he saw it too. I thought you were going to yell at us or something for stopping. We all continued on towards camp when one of the guys who was walking behind me told me to look up ahead of you. I look up and see a very large wolf standing in front of us, roughly 60 yards away. You have to understand, these weren't just wolves. These were extremely oversized, very large, and standing upright. We decided to move out away from view of this thing, and immediately, we noticed we were actually surrounded by several of them, hiding up in the trees all around us, and we never knew it the entire time. completely panicked by being surrounded by these large unknown wolf creatures. We fled back the way we came, while having our weapons drawn. It was dark, and it did not help that we were running through the thorn bushes and rocks as quickly as we can go. We took cover behind a large rock outcropping, where we waited until our supervisor showed up, along with 2 other fellow rangers. We told them what had happened. We didn't know how to make of it or what to make of it, but I didn't care what they called it, and I still don't, because I know what I saw. That night was just a warm-up for the following night. That's when we really got our first up-close and personal look at these creatures. During the search for a lost hunter, we made a pretty good plan on how to handle the search. I was the point for our team, which consisted of 2 rangers and 3 law enforcement. We were searching a drainage that I knew to be a very dangerous in the dark spot because of a lot of loose rocks, steep hillsides, and thick underbrush. This is where the hunter was last spotted. Quick note, he was not hunting at this point in time. He's referred to as a hunter because he's very well known in the area. My ranger partner, who was roughly 30 feet behind me, had stopped and told me to wait up. I proceeded slowly until I was even with him, and he made me stop so he could show me something. He pointed down into the drainage and said, "Do you see that? What is that?" I looked at what he was pointing at, but I couldn't see anything of significance. Instead, my partner insisted there was something there. Looking at it from this angle, I realized there was an unnatural shape to the bush down in the drainage. I had my M16 with me, and immediately handed it off to my partner, who stayed back as I slowly made my way down towards whatever was down there. I got within 5 feet of the object, which turned out to be a downed log. I heard the most terrifying growl right behind me. My heart jumped into my throat, and I immediately turned around to face whatever it was that made the sound. Immediately, in front of me, were 2 of these creatures. All I can see in the dark at first was their eyes. They had reflective red eyes, which is what really gave me the impression that they were these wolf things at first. They got up so close to me, I could see their teeth and hear them breathing heavily with the growls coming from their throats. One of them actually stuck their arm out to grab me, but I was able to be pulled up just in time by my fellow ranger who had heard the growling and began coming down to find out what was going on. We decided not to fire at these things. We didn't know exactly what we were dealing with here. I didn't know how much of this I could take. It was now getting really real for me, but I kept my composure enough to tell my partner to call in backup. We were able to get back up onto the high rock bluff, where we were able to get a signal on our radios. We relayed the message to my supervisor. There was something out there, and we needed backup immediately. He ordered us to remain as quiet as possible until they could respond, which I thought would be never at this point. But it wasn't long when we heard them coming in right behind us. The ground shook, and we could smell the wolves in front of us. But they didn't move until a bright spotlight shined on them down in the drainage. The front wolf, or whatever you want to call it, stood still for a moment, as if it was wondering what this light was before getting up and turning back toward us and leaving us in the dark once more. Both of them ran off into the night, which we did not pursue. We knew there was a search team coming up behind us, so we waited for them in hopes that they would be better armed with something more than what we had before going back down into that pit of hell. During this time, I noticed that the wolves were nothing like any dogs or coyotes I have ever seen. They were gigantic, taller than a Great Dane, and much wider. Their legs were straight up, wide apart, allowing them to easily put their front paws on the human's chest, ripping it open, if they wanted to. When they ran, they were kind of hunched over, with their back end raised high in the air. I also noticed they did not have any real teeth, except for many sharp tiny teeth and long canine fangs extending past their lips when their mouths were open. After this night, that would be the last we would encounter of these bizarre creatures. I'm not sure what they were or where they came from, but I have no explanation for them. There were over 20 sightings just like this one recorded way back in the 70s, while many of us still work there. Not me though, and many more since. At one point, they were referred to as wolves of death because there seemed to be a sort of pattern to how they killed. We would find many large bison and other large game animals killed in disturbing ways. Not killed and eaten like traditional predators do. Torn to ribbons and mutilated. It's like whatever was killing these animals was killing just for the sake of it. Moral of the story is, whatever these creatures were or are, they are extremely dangerous and should not be approached by any means. There's no telling what they would have done to me had I not had my team with me, or had I been caught down there with less equipment than I had. Just know whatever you see out in parks is not natural and should be avoided at all costs. The ranger who was with me that night had a pretty good run as far as rangers do, but from what I've heard, he retired around the same time this thing happened. He just kind of fell off the face of the earth, so to speak, which we all found strange. I'm not sure if there was any follow-up done by our park management after these sightings, but I didn't hear anything about it happening again, at least on paper. Story 1. The Stairs. One of the strangest things I have ever come across in my job as a ranger was a full staircase in the middle of the woods. There was nothing else around it to show that it was a part, or had been, of any original structure. No walls to suggest there was once a house there, and there were far too many trees anyway. And finding that it wasn't an exclusive experience was even stranger. Apparently, coming across a staircase in the middle of nowhere that has no purpose wasn't an unusual occurrence, but it didn't make the experience any less weird and creepy. I stood and stared for a long time. The other thing that made the whole thing even more unnerving was just how quiet it was. If finding a set of stone steps, and yes, they looked like something straight out of Game of Thrones, which wasn't odd enough, I would have imagined there would have been signs of life. Birds on the stone, bugs, even moss growing. But there was nothing. Nothing at all. I couldn't resist climbing them myself, even though they were fairly high and unsteady. I couldn't help myself. And of course, that was when I came across the most disturbing thing of all, because until now, the stairs had been an oddity, a curiosity. But now, they became something from a nightmare, because at the very top, on the very last step, was blood. Now, I will add why I was out in the very remote part of the forest. We were helping to look for a missing woman. Search and rescue and the police were doing bulk of the job. But since it was a vast area, and they needed all hands on deck, we all were in. Although she was never found. After I got back to the base and reported no sign of her, but told the team leader about the stairs, the first thing I was asked was, "Did you climb them?" When I replied yes, she told me to never, ever do that again, and also informed me that now the missing woman would never be found, when I tried to ask her how any of this was connected. She shooed me out of the office and told me to not mention what I did to anybody, and if I did, I would be risking our lives. And that was the end of that. Story 2. Pile of Bones. I was out with one of the dogs one day in one of the very remote parts of the park that I work in as a ranger. There are literally hundreds of miles of forest, and we were about as far in as you could get. Surrounding the edge of the trees, wherever we were mountains, some of them with vertical drops that made them look almost man-made. Before you get to the full-size mountains, there were some much smaller mounds of rocks. I say smaller, and they were still the size of a 3 or 4-story building, but smaller in comparison to the size of the main ones. And again, several of these had entirely vertical frontage and were almost completely smooth too. This meant even an extremely sure-footed creature would not be able to shimmy up there, unless they were maybe Spider-Man. And yet, whenever we went over that way, the dogs would always go nuts. Ranger canines are also often trained as search animals, and have a very keen sense of smell and aptitude for knowing when something is amiss. They would always, without fail, give the indication that there was something on top of those smaller structures, despite it being almost entirely impossible. One day, the local search and rescue team was needing some practice, and they had the chopper out. Since we are good buddies with the guys, I mentioned this particular spot that the dogs always go mad over. We all had a good chuckle about it, and they decided to land the chopper there, as if nothing else. It was a good place as any to do a dummy rescue. I asked if I could come along, just to intrigue my curiosity. And do you know what we found? Bones. Nothing else but several piles of human bones. Not full skeletons either, but at least 4 different bodies worth. 3 adults, 1 child. 3 male, 1 female. All varying in how long they'd been there, from what the medical examiner could tell. There was no way on or off that ledge. No signs of anything else having ever been there. We never did find an explanation for that one. Story 3. Dakota Miller's Disappearance. Hi, what lurks beneath. I used to work, myself, in the forest industry service, and I have my own very disturbing 411-styled story. The person who went missing in this little story was a little 7-year-old boy who went by the name of Dakota Miller. You could probably look him up, but I don't know if you'll find anything, as before I wrote this up to you, I looked and couldn't find anything. I'm not sure why that is. But anyway, back in the late 90s, Dakota was a regular little boy who had a loving mom and dad. Apparently what happened, it was said that the family went camping for a week, I believe, south of St. Louis, when the mom and dad had their back turned for just a moment, as many of these 411 cases seem to go, and just like that, the little boy had vanished. It was summertime, so he was seen wearing a dark blue shirt and red shorts and sneakers. They were at the campsite when the boy disappeared. There were no other campers nearby. No possible way he could just vanish like that. The nearest trees were easily 40 to 50 feet away. They were perfectly in the clear. It was as if he had just vanished, evaporated, like he was a vapor in the air. Search and rescue went on for well over 10 days in search of this little boy. When 6 days, about 200 miles away, they found the exact same pair of sneakers, shorts, and shirt that he had been wearing the day of his disappearance. Only due to the terrain and distance of the finding, they weren't sure if these clothing correlated to the boy. After some research and DNA matching, it turned to be that these were the exact same sneakers, shorts, and t-shirt of Dakota, who went missing only 6 days prior to being found, at least his clothes. There was no underwear in his clothing. There was also no dirt marks, no scuffs. His clothes were just as clean and as neat as the day he had disappeared. His clothes were randomly found by an older gentleman who was out hiking that day along the upper northern section of Arkansas. Dakota's body and his remains were never discovered. But like any 411 story, the most disturbing thing is how did he go from alive to disappearing so quick? And how? Where are his remains? What happened to him? And now, nearly 20 years later, after trying to look into it more, there's still nothing. It was inconclusive, and after I believe the 12th day of search and rescue, they called it off, with the only findings they had were his clothing. That was it. As far as we know, the world, he's just gone. Story 4. Lycanthropy and the Cover-Up. I haven't really heard anybody else on your show say this, so I'll say it for them. If you are wanting a quiet and laid-back job, don't become a park ranger. Being a park ranger doesn't put you at the back of the world where you'll be safe and unharmed. No. Being a ranger puts you at the forefront of the line. Marines, National Guard, SEALs. Give me one of those guys for 6 weeks, and I guarantee you, they'll be crapping their pants in ways they never did during basic. Look, the job puts you right at the contact point between the edge of humanity and the edge of darkness. As a park ranger, you are the unwitting crosswalk guard, because there are always people trying to plunge into the darkness, and there are always things in the darkness trying to break through into the domain of man. Now with that little rant out of the way, here's my personal story. Rumors of wild animal attacks in the park began to pile up. People would come out of the park with bite marks, slash wounds that were made by something from the animal kingdom. But a few of the victims reported that the assailant was a man. A couple even went on to say that it was a full-on lycanthropy, the delusion held by a person that they are a wolf or a werewolf. I didn't exactly sign on to take down nut jobs, but myself and my fellow rangers were briefed on what to do if we ever ran into the predator at large, and what we would do if it was an animal, and what we would do if it was a human being. And thus, we were expected to be more alert and vigilant and proactive than we were to begin with. I was out on patrol when I was sure that I saw movement in the trees. It looked unusual. I prayed that it wasn't a predator. I wasn't afraid. I just didn't want to tangle with anything. I readied my service firearm, got out of the car, and called out in the direction of the movement. There was a response. I was met with the face of a man, with hair so long that he would probably step on it if he wasn't careful. His eyes were wide open, to the point they were perfectly round O's. He tilted his head at me in a mocking sneer. His teeth were yellow and pink, and I'm pretty sure that he was completely naked. So, it was a safe bet that he was a nutcase. But I did mind the protocol, and behaved as if he could understand me. I called to him to stand down, and stop for a chat. He was waiting for me in a clearing. That beard of his was swaying like brown vines, hanging from an ancient swamp tree. Madness rang out like an emergency siren from his eyes. There was no way that he was a rational human being. I trained my firearm on him, and again, attempted to talk him down. That's when he projectile vomited something foul and bloody onto me. Stunned with disgust, not only was it obvious that he had spewed blood on me, the contents of his stomach was a whole collection of small fingers, way too tiny to be that of an adult, and the sheer number suggested that he had fed on multiple children. I almost felt that he had engorged himself just for the occasion. As a parent and a new grandparent, the situation had just taken a very personal turn. I gave chase, and this maniac howled long and high. It's not possible to explain just how fast he was. I would be close to catching up, as to get a clear shot, and then he was darting ahead, out of range. I began to feel that I was being toyed with. The madness of the whole thing turned just plain evil when the pursuit took me out onto one of the playgrounds where plenty of kids were present. Like lightning, the nude, grinning monster had grabbed up a tiny girl by the hair, scrawny as a newborn deer, and sunken his teeth into one of her eyes and bitten it out. When I fired, he had already flung her up in the line of fire, and just like that, she was a one-eyed human shield. Her body knocked me back as she hit me square in the face. When I was regaining myself, the monster was already lunging at yet another child. I was able to react in a fraction of the time, only thanks to the adrenaline tearing through my system. Skull fragments flew, and his outstretched fingers went limp before he could wrap them around a boy's small neck. I don't think I've ever fought so hard to keep consciousness. My body was trying to black out, probably to cushion me from the knowledge that I had just shot a child the instant after she had been mutilated by a crazed monster. That's when the thought hit me. Was she even dead? I was beginning to see double. I found her face down in the grass. Her hysterical parents were running to her, turning her over, looking at her eye socket. This might be the most frightening part of all. Somewhere inside of me came the urge to shoot it. She was ruined. She would be scarred. And it was all because I was half a second too slow. One shot ruined. It was almost like I was hearing the thought out loud, like it was being put into my brain. But my brain had finally snapped, and I blacked out. I'm not too sure the outcome of everything once I regained consciousness. The police were on all this pretty quickly. I resigned after being blackmailed, and I can't give too much details about that. But I know SUVs and men in suits were quick at the scene. It's probably no surprise that none of this made it to the news or any news outlets online. And as far as I know, they took that little girl, who by the way was still alive, into custody on their end. Again, I don't know whatever happened, but I don't work in that job field anymore. Story 5. The Mysterious Black Bear. The park I work in also has a large camping area. Sometimes, we act more like security, trying to keep people from going into the restricted areas of the woods and parkland after dark. These areas are out of bounds for very good and often uninteresting reasons. Sometimes, there may be rare birds' nests that we don't want disturbed. or there's been some torrential rain, which has made a certain area treacherous. But people sometimes like to think they know better. One important thing about the park I work at is there are no bears. No bears at all in the entire area. Not been a bear sighting here for decades, actually. So, when we got a report from a little girl about seeing a really, really large black bear, we were pretty confused, and also thought the girl must be too. I had a good search in the area anyway, just to please the child, and was stunned to find that there were very clearly bear claw scratches on trees where the child had reportedly seen the animal. There was no other evidence, and we searched thoroughly through the whole park for any other signs, but nothing. We still have no idea how it would be even possible for a huge bear to appear out of nowhere when there hadn't even been a single bear sighting in the entire county for nearly 70 years. And even more, how only one small girl could see it. Then it just disappears again. If it had been for the fresh scratches, we would have thought that it was a prank by one of our own animal experts, even though they were adamant that it was legitimate. We will never know for certain exactly what happened and how it was even possible. There was talk about it being a ghost of a bear, but that's not something I tend to believe in. However, I really couldn't think of any other possible explanation. Story 6. Not always human. My patrol had become so sleepy that I began taking the liberty of spending the earliest part of it walking one of the shorter trails. It's technically not a bad thing to do. It just meant that I wouldn't be able to speed off to respond to any incidents right away. But I was coming up on week 6 without any kind of alert. So I began to relax my approach to things. And yes, Murphy's Law has a way of singling people like me out. I was at the point on the trail that was the furthest from my car when I had heard a horrible shrieking that shattered the silence of the forest. I was torn between sprinting back to my car and just running to where the screaming seemed to be coming from. But when you're surrounded by trees like that, it's pretty impossible to gauge just how far away any sound is. I opted for doing the whole thing on foot, promising myself that I'd never leave my car behind again. The screaming continued, and I seemed to be zeroing in on it. But when I thought I was going to come up on a source, it would suddenly be another 15 seconds of running away. I wondered if I was having hearing issues, or if the acoustics of the forest were just so unfortunately arranged that screwed with my perceptions badly. But it kept happening. My urgency began to melt into suspicion. I did the worst thing that any park ranger could do in a situation like that, and I stopped chasing. Instead, I began creeping. I crept up through the tall grasses, ducking behind trees, trying to get as close to the noise as I could before whatever it was could give me the slip again. It worked. Peering out from behind my tree, I saw something that was only vaguely human. From its head to its neck, to its shoulders, was a stretched membrane of skin that almost made it look like a nun's headwear. Except it was skin. The whole thing was nude, and seemed to be of the female persuasion. Its chest was flat and long, and pendulous. The eyes were gaping and yellowed. The mouth was something else, and it stretched open, almost like it was distended, unhinged like a snake's jaw. And the unnaturally yawning cavity bellowed another plaintive cry of distress. The polarity of everything changed in that very moment. I was being deceived. But deceived into what, I didn't know. I put one hand on my pistol, just to be safe, and I began to back away from the direction I was heading. The creature, or whatever, swayed, as if anxious, and it let out another, longer, louder cry. I just kept backing up. This caused the creature to scream again, but not in distress. It was the howl of an enraged predator, deprived of a meal. It rocketed toward me, propelling itself through its strides with its knuckles, like that of a gorilla. In the time that it took me to bring my pistol up to an aiming position, the creature was close enough for me to spit on. Luck was on my side at the last possible second. My shot landed right between the eyes of it, and it face-planted hard into the ground. Here's the part that might get rejected from being read. I got ready to radio out and tell the office what I had just experienced, but the body of the creature slowly crumbled into a pile of white, pulsating embers that cooled off into gray ashes. I poked at the pile for bones or anything, but there was nothing left. I quickly told the main office that there was nothing wrong, and when they questioned me, I just told them off. I quickly dismissed anything and told them I didn't feel well, and then, shortly afterwards, I quit that job entirely. Story 7. Real Life Wood Wampas. Years ago, back when I was living up in the state of Maine for a few years, I loved to go explore the outdoors. In fact, I made it a thing during the spring and summer, to go and try and hike as many trails as I could. Most of it was to just motivate me to get in shape and stay in shape, having dealt with extremely toxic eating habits and a lot of weight gain. I figured the best thing for me was to be out in nature, hiking, losing weight. After all, I hated running, jogging, working out. But I loved the woods, and walking almost feels like you're not doing anything, and it's easily one of the best and easiest exercises to pull off. I would usually start walking anywhere between 3 to 5 miles a day. I had no problems with it. I loved it. So, in hindsight, it's the reason why I lost so much weight. But on this particular day, in July, would stop my progression for at least a month, because whatever I saw scared the living terror out of me. I get there to the trailhead, and I'm getting out of my car when I notice I'm the only one in the parking lot, even though it was a very small parking lot, but still. It was a beautiful day in late July, and the only other vehicle I could see was a ranger's vehicle, who drove up to me quickly as I was getting my own backpack out the back seat. He called me over and wanted to speak to me, ask what I was doing. I told him I was working on endurance walking, going up the trail, and this one was about a 5-mile loop, which I told him was perfect. He informed me, and his behavior was very disturbing, that I should try and find a different trailhead in a different area, and said there's been some possible animal sightings that were unknown and could pose a threat. I looked at him strangely and asked him, "Do you mean like wolves or bears?" And I'll never forget him looking away, looking down and just saying, "No, not quite," and just kept referring back to that it's probably not the best idea I choose to hike this path, that it could potentially be dangerous. He was acting really weird, avoiding specific answers and wouldn't answer my questions. I thought the dude was weird. Afterwards, he ended the conversation, drove off, and wished me luck. I was thinking, whatever, dude. So, I walked off and did my thing. I get about 4 miles down the trail, probably about near an hour in. I was a pretty fast walker. Like I said, I was probably a little over an hour into my trail when I come around a bend in the small trail, and directly ahead of me, coming right out of the trees, were two extremely large brown-shaped humanoid things walking right towards me at a slow pace. My first thought, actually, get this, when I saw these two things, and forgive me because I can't remember their names, but in Star Wars, you have these white Yeti-looking things, the same creature that I believe Luke kills in Episode 5, but forgive me if I'm wrong. They reminded me of that. Big, huge hands, humanoid, except they were brown, but they kinda had that same walk, slow and menacing. I immediately turned back around and started running as fast as I could, thinking to myself, if these are Bigfoot, I'm most certainly dead. I'm not sure if it was my endurance at the time or pure terror taking over me, but I ran the extra 4 miles back to the parking lot in probably half the time that it took me up the trail. Also, I contribute that to the fact that it was mostly downhill, so maybe 20 to 30 minutes. The things, well, I don't know if they ever followed me. I never turned around to check, but either way, it scared the lights out of me. Did I get a real good look at them? No. I saw enough to know that it was no bueno. 9 foot tall, hairy wood-looking ape beast humanoid things. Scary, scary, scary. I never did go back to that trailhead again after that, and hiked in completely different areas. A few years later, I moved out of the state, down to Florida, where I still am today. Still, I've gone through some crazy stuff in my life, and nothing at all compares to the terror I felt in that moment and on that day. Now maybe I understand why that park ranger was acting so strange. He must have known something. Why he didn't tell me, I'll never know. Story 8. The Scream. I was out in the truck once when something really weird happened. I'm a park ranger out in Maine, and if you know that state at all, it is huge and can be quite eerie in certain places. There are tons of animals out here, and one of the most dangerous that I have ever come across are actually moose. They can be very dangerous, but I felt perfectly safe in my vehicle. That was when I heard the screaming. I used to work in California, and I would hear this sound often enough. It sounded like a woman dying, as if she was being violently attacked or murdered. But it was in fact a mountain lion, which, after all, was no less scary to happen upon. But there are not any cougars in Maine, so this really was a woman screaming. I called it in, as there should not have been anybody this far out, except rangers, and I knew there weren't any female staff out and about that day. I then continued to drive around to see if I could find her, and at this point, I was still sure it was a her, and that she was in trouble. I mean, why would you think anything else? I heard that high-pitched, very female scream about 4 more times before I came across to an area that I had never been to before. Not even in my vehicle. There are quite a lot of caves and caverns in this part of the park too. Again, I radioed my colleagues, said to come join me. A couple arrived, and we got out and began looking around, specifically the cave openings. We couldn't see or hear anything now, and most of them had rocks or plants growing up around the mouths of the cave, so it would be obvious if somebody had been in or out the way they would be disturbed. All of a sudden, one of the newer rangers, a rookie, shouted that he had seen something up in one of the larger trees.
We quickly ascertained that there was nobody up there. But the thing that the kid had seen was pretty weird. It was a purse. A rather large lady's purse. It was empty. But we couldn't think of a single way that it could have gotten that high up, and so far into the branches. We kept searching, but never found anything. There were no women reported missing. No purses reported missing. It was just another mystery to add to the ever-growing list of weird stuff that happens out in the woods. Story 9. Ghosts of the Past. Not far from the park where I served as a ranger was a barred-off property surrounded by thick timber that served as training grounds for police. It looked like a really elaborate treehouse for gun-loving kids, but no. It was very much for adults, and it was for anything but playing. Elevated land surrounded the setup on all sides, so that there was no chance of a stray bullet harming anybody outside the training ground. Rangers see far less firefights than police do, but most of us do carry a gun, so it came as no surprise that it was decided that myself and my fellow rangers would spend a few hours a day for a week brushing up on our marksmanship. My time slot was taken care of by an officer we'll call Colette. I was puzzled at the fact that it was just me and her, because I knew that I had seen the others being trained as a group. But you eventually stop trying to make sense of the decisions of your superiors. You know, just like at any other job. Colette was a very admirable instructor. She was patient when she found out that I had the precision of a shotgun. She wasn't much for small talk, but she wasn't a stuffed shirt either. She was just there to do her job and do it politely. As the days passed, I thought my eyes were beginning to play tricks on me. I thought I noticed these deep, dark welts on Colette that hadn't been there the day before. She insisted that they had always been there, but I wasn't so sure. I tried to rationalize it away as a simple matter of her forgetting to put makeup on, but they were awful to look at. Some of them looked like sunken-in wounds. Then there was this awful smell attached to her, and I'm not talking about discrepancy in hygiene. This was the gagging stench of straight-up rot and death, minus her injuries. She looked as clean as ever. It made no sense that she would smell any kind of way. I kept trying to find a way to bring it up before I would end up vomiting in front of her, but I just couldn't. The last day of training, everyone would be trained together. All groups, all instructors. Colette was the last one to show up, and she had turned an awful color since the day before. One of the other park rangers was now visibly shaken to the point that he was turning colors himself. Colette acted like she was seeing a long-lost friend when she caught sight of him, and she moved in for a friendly hug. But he recoiled in disgust. Colette shrugged, and she shook me by the hand and led me off to a far corner of the training ground where trees grew very dense together. She told me that she enjoyed her time with me, and that she knew she could trust me with what she was going to show me next. My fellow ranger from earlier raced over to us and was absolutely out of his mind, stammering and trying to shoo me away from whatever it was that Colette was going to do. I was confused. I told him to shut up, and I'd be with him in a moment. This made him worse. He seemed to be getting desperate. He aimed his pistol right at me. He was the portrait of a man who had become completely unglued. Yet another ranger had followed us, suspicious of the other's dramatic behavior. Dramatic ranger took a round to the thigh from suspicious ranger, causing him to drop his pistol. I was grateful and took the piece before dramatic ranger could get it back. Colette had me move some medium-sized rocks from a depression in the earth. I wasn't surprised to find what I found. There were bones, complete with tattered clothing and a badge that had Colette's name on it. There was a second badge, one that must have ended up there on accident. It belonged to Dramatic Ranger. I looked up at Colette, who was smiling at me, looking both sad and pleased with herself, and then she vanished. Suspicious Ranger denied seeing Colette at any given time. I grilled him over it, asking him who had just been taking me out to training all week. He figured I just prefer to train by myself, and thought I was just kind of a bamf for it. The body indeed turned out to be Colette's, and Dramatic Ranger confessed to be the murder from a few years back. Others remarked at how he had lost his badge, like he had a way of losing everything else, so it didn't stand out as something unusual for him. He went to prison, which left me, the only other person that had actually seen Colette. My drinking habit got a little worse after that. I never was the supernatural or superstitious type, and there was honestly no way to explain what I had just experienced for an entire week in materialistic terms. So, here, have a story. Nobody, which I understand, can confirm or deny the events but me. But it's hands down the most terrifying realistic experience I've ever had with an actual ghost of somebody once living. I never did believe, but now I firmly do. Story 10. The Faceless. One of the most frightening things that I have ever experienced was on a nighttime shift as a park ranger. Now, to be clear with you, I work in the UK. We do not have many predators like bears, wolves, pumas, etc. The scariest creatures I have come across are vixens, who are in season. They scream like they are being attacked, as they also do when mating, and a badger who appeared out of nowhere and scared the life out of me, as he very obviously hadn't missed a meal in quite some time. But shrieking foxes and fat badgers are par of the course. They might give you a shock when you're out and about, but they won't follow you home and haunt your dreams. That particular attribute is saved for the faceless man, and I'm not the only ranger to have seen him. My own experience came one night when I was out on the moor, just making a routine patrol of the entire area. We don't tend to get many waifs and strays up here. Too cold. Sometimes we do get notified to keep an eye out for the odd runaway, but 99 times out of 100, we never see a thing. It was a particularly bleak night. Cold, wet, and I was dying to get back to the office for a much-needed cup of tea. And that moment, of course, was when I saw somebody run past the van. That sight alone was enough to shock me as I rammed on the brake to make sure I didn't hit him. He didn't even seem to notice me. He just kept running alongside the road. At this point, I didn't think anything supernatural was happening. It was just some bloke out running, although that alone wasn't a good sign in this weather, and there was no way you should be on the moor in the dark. So I started up the van, and I followed. It only struck me afterwards that I, in a vehicle, should have easily caught up with him and overtaken a person on foot. But this chap was really fast. When I eventually caught up to him, after a few moments, I pulled alongside and must have been doing around 40 miles an hour, just keeping pace. I rolled down my window and called over to him, asking if he was okay, suggesting I give him a lift home. Then he turns and looks at me. Well, I presume he was looking at me. You see, he had no eyes or face. It was just a blur. The man himself seemed corporeal. He wasn't transparent or anything, like I would have presumed a ghost would be. Everything about his body looked real and solid. He just didn't have a face, just a head, with a fuzzy, blurry pixelation instead of facial features. It was a good job that the road over the moor was totally straight and I had nothing to crash into, as right then, I was so freaked out that I would have hit something for certain. He seemed to speed up even faster, and then turned off the road and zoomed off down the moor. I'm not embarrassed to say that I was terrified right then, and raced back to the office as fast as I can manage. I'll never forget walking through the door, and the supervisor taking one look at me and switching the kettle on. "I guess you saw the no-face runner then," she had said. It seemed that most of the team had come across him at one time or another. He never tried anything. Didn't appear to be an omen or anything, but you could never catch him. If you tried to drive or run after him, he would disappear. Most sightings of things like this have some sort of legend attached, so you at least can make a guess as to who the person was, and why they're there. I mean, it would have made sense if there had been some sort of hit-and-run accident, and there had been the man killed. But if that was the case, it had never been reported, which in its own right was highly unusual. We never had any reports from members of the public either. It only seemed to be us, the members, us rangers, who got to see him. Very mysterious indeed. Story 11. Suicide Ritual. It had been hitting the news around our parts that various landmarks had been disappearing from the tourist route that ran through our corner of Texas. The thieves had targeted nothing but old-time fast food joints that had those oversized cartoonish fiberglass sculptures as part of the storefront. Hot dogs with jolly faces and arms and legs. Pigs that looked like Porky wearing chef hats and aprons. Stuff like that. Things from a time when America was really America. Well, these things are getting lifted, and the crooks were getting away with it so far. As a park ranger, somebody who thoroughly serves in the forest industry, it would be a stretch for me to make a connection between any of those disappearing sculptures and my day job. I forgot about those reports almost as soon as I had heard about them. While on patrol on one of the trails, my vehicle was suddenly under fire. Bullet holes were punched into the hood. The windshield was spiderwebbed. I threw the car into park and ducked down, radioing out for help, and got a confirmation. I thought about the gas tank, which had just been filled up, so it was going to be a bad idea to sit in the car. A few more holes punched into the passenger side, so I took the chance of getting out of the car on the driver's side. Backup arrived, and long story short, we nailed the shooters without much trouble. I kind of figured they had been on a suicide mission of some sort, and just wanted to go out with a bang. I turned one body over and looked into the face of a man who had painted his face something like a cartoon rabbit. The sort of thing kids would do at a carnival. Except this was a 30-plus-year-old man. The other shooter was painted to look like a smiling pig. Looking around the pocket of timber that they had been shooting from, we found the missing fiberglass sculptures reported about in the news. They were dressed up in hoodies and jackets and bathrobes and arranged in a large circle around the mutilated body of a beautiful young woman. At the feet of each sculpture were alternating red and black candles. It turned out the woman had been beaten, raped, and mutilated. The blood was found inside a repurposed bleach bottle. Some of it had been poured on each sculpture, staining their improvised clothes. The sculptures were tediously identified and hauled off to be held until the rightful owners could get them. At the time, I didn't think there would be any more to the story. And I hate to say it, but grisly things like that add to this place's popularity. And our section of the state was kind of hurting for tourism and commerce. I know, it sounds incredibly cold. I am divorced, if that says anything. So, each sculpture ended up in the right place, and it was celebrated in the news. Not long after, it was reported that the restaurant owners were throwing the previously stolen sculptures away, some of them even being burned. Only a couple of the owners were even willing to give a statement, and they were vague about it at best. They said something along the lines of it not feeling right, or they must have been cursed. Strange things have happened since sculptures came back, none of them being good for business, despite the spike in traffic because of notoriety. The stories that weren't revealed in the news were whispered throughout the community in the years to come. It certainly was one of the strangest experiences of mine on the job, and really one of my only hand-to-hand experiences with the occult. Story 12. The Great Search. One of the worst times to be a ranger is in the winter, especially if your area is up in the mountains. We do our god best to tell people to stay away. Snow is dangerous, especially if you don't know what you're doing. Not just avalanches and heavy drifts, but there are all sorts of other dangers, like tree wells, and things that appear solid but are apt to give away and have you plunge to a very painful death. Of course, we still have to go out and about and check the terrain and on any animals out there too. Most, of course, which are hibernating, but it is still a part of the job to make sure they are safe too. And that was when we got a call to say that a family, dad, mom, and 2 little girls, had gone up the mountain and not come back. Neighbors had called the cops after they had been missing for a couple of days. The dad had asked the neighbor to let the dog out, but assured her they would be home in time for dinner. When they weren't, she did not panic right away, but when they weren't back for the following day's dinner, she called the cops, who alerted us and sent out search parties. We found the parents almost straight away, at the bottom of a ravine, both crumpled and bloodied, and, well, very dead. No sign of either children. The weather was horrendous. Snow still coming in strong, and it was making it next to impossible to look for tracks. We searched all the caves and caverns in the area, anywhere they may have crawled into for shelter. But nothing. After another 2 days of relentless snow and futile searching, we gave up. Even if they were there, They were most likely frozen, died due to exposure. As awful as it sounds, we resigned ourselves to the fact that they would likely turn up when the snow began to thaw. Well, a few days later, we did find one, completely by chance, when we'd been out to check on one of the caves where we knew there was a young family of bears. Although in the same park, this particular cave was roughly 20 miles from the spot where the parents' bodies had been found. It would have been almost impossible for a small 4-year-old child to get through the snow and make it over that way. And yet, there she was. Not a mark on her. Thankfully, the smell of her had not woken the bears. She was, of course, dead, but appeared completely frozen, not injured. During the autopsy report, it was discovered that fish and berries were in her stomach, which had been consumed just a few hours before her dying. As for the other child, she was never found. She simply vanished into the snow, and, well, never returned. There was another full-scale search for the body after the thaw began. They even searched for bones in and around the caves in case she'd been dragged off and eaten. All that was ever found was one of her snow boots and one glove, both of them miles apart from each other. The boot just in the middle of a path and went and led nowhere, and one glove at almost the very top of a fir tree. There was no trace of blood or any other evidence on either. It remains an open case to this day. This happened almost 5 years ago, but even now, when I'm out on one of my patrols, I always keep a lookout for her or any other part of her or her clothing. She is by far not the only person that goes missing, not by a long shot. Something happened to these people. Something or someone takes them, or they're experiencing something we will never have an answer for. Is there some sort of monster out there? Do parks act as some kind of beacon to UFOs? I don't think we will ever know for sure, but I'm 100% certain that somebody knows what's going on. If you or someone you know has a story or encounter they would like to share with me, please send it to stories@whatlurksbeneath.com. Story 1. Trail of Cadavers. It's true. There's a well-known saying about us park rangers. You get paid in sunrises and sunsets. You don't do this job for the pay. And sometimes, you have to wonder why we work so hard to get these federal jobs. You must know, the people who are naturally inclined to take these kinds of jobs enjoy nature, enjoy complete and utter solitude. It's the most unlikely group of people you'd ever expect to want to work with. And it's probably no secret, you have to give up a lot. It's very difficult for any family or for you to meet somebody. You'll work for years and years until you finally can get a permanent spot, only to realize you're kicked out. But if you're a nature freak like I am, there are so many pros to this position, although just about any job you take has its cons. This one included. I'll let you in on a little story that happened to me a few years back when I was still doing my rounds as a ranger. We had gotten complaints from a campsite at the farther end of the park. I checked this family in myself only a couple days prior. Not the kind that would have a bad attitude. The kind that would be polite and not complain about small, inefficient things. I made my way over there and got a chance to talk to the father. He was complaining that there was this horrendous smell, what he think was possibly a dead deer nearby. He told me he hadn't smelt it the day prior. I went to go check it out myself because when somebody tells you this, you naturally become curious. Now, my first thought was that maybe some coyotes had gone upon a deer, or maybe a doe had just recently died and started rotting and stinking. You never know. So, I go back behind the camp. Everything seems okay. I travel a little further, maybe 30 to 40 yards, and there we go, bingo. In this tiny little crevice in the ground, I found a doe, well, at least part of her. Her spine and innards had been torn out from her stomach and chest. This was a very violent death, something natural predators don't normally seem to do. I've seen the way mountain lion kill, and I've seen the way wolves and coyotes kill. They're all very similar to an extent. They eat the cadaver, they tear things apart, but not like this. This seemed like it was done with human intention or force. This animal also appeared to have broken forelegs, as if something grabbed it, held it down, and tore its body open. It was unusual and very grisly. The other odd piece of it too was that the smell wasn't coming from this doe. In fact, even though this doe had appeared to be dead for a couple days now, was currently bloating, and there were some maggots about, it actually didn't really have much of a smell for whatever reason. And the campers, being about 40 yards away, should not have smelt it at all. Maybe the wind was picking it up. I wasn't sure. It just didn't make much sense to me. So, I disposed of this cadaver or whatever was left. That's when I got a call on my radio, saying that another camper on the other side of the park was also complaining of a very similar situation. An overpowering stench of rotting dead animal, and was convinced there was a bear around. I worked my way all the way to the other end of the park and spoke to this individual, a middle-aged man who was camping by himself, complaining about the same thing as the other family, a horrendous stench of death. Although this time, when I investigated, I went about as far as 100 yards outside of his camp into the forest. I couldn't find a trace of the smell, nor could I find the smell myself, or see any reason why there would be such a smell. I had asked him again, the last time he smelt it, how often had he been smelling it, and he said it would come and go, and only started smelling it in the past day. I did another thorough investigation by myself, but could not find anything. That was the end of that day. About 2 days go by, and I don't hear anything, any more complaints. The park is somewhat busy, which is even more of a surprise that I didn't get any complaints about that particular thing, which I guess is also a good thing. Hopefully, whatever it was had passed, although it's common to find dead animals, sometimes. It wasn't common the way they were dying or the way people were describing smelling them, but I guess I didn't think that much of it at the time, considering it was only 2 individuals that made a small complaint. This is where my story ties its ends. I very distinctly remember this day. I can remember it was pouring down rain, or at least throughout the day, we're having bouts of rain. And I got a complaint from an elderly lady and her husband who seemed to be long-term campers. She complained that she had heard some sort of screaming and smelt the awful same stench that had been described to me by previous campers. A scream, I wondered. After inquiring more about it, she described it as maybe a deer or something, possibly coyotes tearing apart a deer. She wasn't sure. This caused me to investigate further, and maybe I would get to the source of this weird thing going on. But to be able to smell that in the pouring rain and with all the humidity out, which means it had to have been strong. Now, this part of the camp I was at, or part of the park, The brush and forest were much thicker than other areas. Even more of a surprise that she could smell it, which would mean whatever the odor source was had to have been close by. I think I made it maybe 60 or 70 yards in before I finally found the source. After making my way through the brush, I saw what it was that was the source of the smell, and I stopped and had to cover my mouth for fear that I would scream or yell. What I saw in front of me was this large, what I thought was a man, pitch black from head to toe, and built very wide, large shoulders, no neck, and kind of a pointed cone head, barrel-like body, long gorilla-like hair, kind of like orangutan, where it's so long that it kind of hangs off you. Whatever this thing was that I was looking at, I caught it in the act. It had a doe in its hands, and right before my eyes, grabbed its head and twisted its head and neck completely off of its body, as if it was a mere piece of paper. The motion was completely effortless, and the deer, if being close to dead, was now dead, no questions asked. It did it so smoothly and so fluidly, I don't think that deer even had time to even blink. After the head was pulled off, there was of course lots of blood. This thing grabbed the deer by the back of the legs and threw it over its shoulder like a hunter would who had just killed a rabbit, and casually walked off. The smell of death and rotting meat followed with it due to the fear of not being believed, mocked, or potentially losing my job. I never said a word to anybody and kept it to myself. I ended up telling the elderly lady that the situation was taken care of and that it was just a dead deer eaten by coyotes, and we would have it taken care of for her. After that, I never saw anything like that again. So I don't know if this was a Sasquatch or what it was, but maybe it was coming through the area to hunt. That's just a guess. I don't know anything about them, but I guess that would make sense if they're anything like us humans. Thank you for taking the time to listen and read my story. Story 2. Watched from the Trees. I've told a few of my close mates about this same story, and I know they always come to the same conclusion. It was probably some unknown animal. But I've been in the woods a lot, and I'm not exactly sure what unknown animal would mean. But I guess that's really the only way to describe what I heard that day, because I certainly never saw what it was, but it made itself audibly known. This was somewhere between 2007 and 2008. I was working as a forest ranger at the time, doing service work on a closed-down trail, currently for maintenance. This would have been in the spring, and we were busy prepping it to open it back up to the public. There had been a landslide on several parts of the trail due to having such an incredibly wet fall and winter. You can't just allow the public to walk on these, you know. We have to make sure that things are deemed safe. It was roughly 2:30, maybe 3 p.m. in the afternoon. An overcast day. Not cold, but not warm by any means. Roughly around the end of March, and I don't know exactly at what point I picked up on it, but everything around me fell silent. Just the wind. There was an uneasiness about this silence. I know it's entirely possible for the forest to go quiet, but usually there's a reason for it. Sometimes it means there's a large predator in the area. Other times it could just be because animals aren't out. But there was just something about this. Like it wasn't that I just suddenly noticed it. My inner being felt it, if that makes sense to you. And it gave me this incredible uneasiness and made me pick up my pace even faster to get to my destination quicker. I wasn't exactly feeling great about the current circumstances. Although during this, I wasn't thinking anything about monsters in the woods or anything like that. I just did not want to be caught off guard, even if there was a predator, like a mountain lion or something like that. And I'll never forget this part. I got to a curve in the trail when I stopped dead in my tracks. Off to my right, where there's a thicker area of brush and trees, and to my left is a sharp rock wall. I heard a low growling noise. It was a kind of growling, like if you continue to come forward, you're going to get attacked, or eaten, or worse. It made me stop, and I looked around, searching for a source of this noise, but I couldn't see anything. The foliage was just starting to grow back, but still very bare and minimal, considering spring had just barely started, and it wasn't at all like May or June, where everything is full and lush with leaves and brush. The noise was sounding like it was up in the trees, and not at ground level. But I figured that was impossible, because I was looking in the direction that I could have sworn I heard the growling coming from, and there was nothing. But it sounded as if it was coming from an animal merely 20 to 30 feet away from me, right off to my 3 o'clock. There was no way to describe it. And then it got deeper and louder and began to get closer to me, with still nothing to see. This made me incredibly fearful. There was no reason why I should not be able to see whatever it was growling at me. There was nothing terribly obstructing my field of vision or view. There was also really no object or tree that an animal of this capacity that can make this deep of growling could hide behind, at least without getting noticed. No, it was not a bear. There would have been nowhere for a bear to hide and continue to make that noise. Then, I heard a very similar growling noise from off to my left, behind me, to my 7 o'clock, where there was more brush and trees. I quickly turned around, and again, didn't see anything. Now, I had to keep watch of my left and my right, and I felt like I was in a pretty sticky situation. So I quickly put my back against the sharp rock ledge and slowly walked my way across the path, away from these sounds. This growling noise, which continued and continued, but never seemed to move, other than come closer to the spot that I was at on the trail. Maybe I was hallucinating. Maybe I was going crazy. But the farther I got away from that spot, it seems like the sounds of the forest began to come back. Even though very minimal, there were still sounds present. And now that I was far enough away, I was beginning to hear them again. I ended up talking to my supervisor and told him that weird stuff is going on the trail, and I would appreciate it if I could walk a different way back and have some help. I should mention this before I forget to, but at that time, my supervisor and the small team of other rangers that I worked with, we all knew that weird stuff went on. None of us were strangers to it, and although we didn't mention anything to the public or to anybody else, we all talked about it, so I felt very comfortable opening up to my supervisor and telling him what had happened. He completely understood. Anyway, I'm sorry if my story isn't all that exciting, but I'm pretty sure it was something other than a wolf or a bear, because neither of those animals make that kind of deep growling. I wish I could tell you what I suspect it was, but I never saw it. Maybe, in some crazy horror science fiction world, it was potentially camouflaged. I don't know. I'll never know. But what I do know is weird stuff like this has gone on in the woods for long, long periods of time, long before I ever became a ranger. With 2020 being one of the most toxic years of my life, luckily, I've been out of the job field for quite some time. But back the year prior, when I was working full-time as a ranger, I've had my fair share of some crazy stories that you probably wouldn't believe. One was that people were claiming to see a large pack of wolves roaming in and all throughout the area. Only problem is, there's no wolves in this entire state, and the pack that people were claiming to see was abnormally large, larger than any wolf pack would ever travel in. Probably around 19 to 20 wolves in total. Very, very large wolves that would come and go as they please. Sometimes they would show up in certain areas and in another unrealistic time frame, show up in an adjacent spot not too far away. The things just weren't exactly adding up. Other people even claimed to see them as translucent or opulent. This would happen in strange spans of time. All of a sudden, people seeing these large packs come and go, and then for months, nothing. And then, these packs of wolves would come and go again. There was no real decipherable pattern. There was no rhythm to it. It was as if it was completely random. On top of that, people would go missing, and then 2 weeks later, all of a sudden show up as if they had never disappeared, having zero memory or anything of them ever being gone. The creepy thing was, they had no idea that time had even passed since their disappearance, nor did they even know that they were even taken or disappeared in the first place. Many of them would even get the dates wrong when asked about what time it was, or what day it was, or even the month. Just stuff like that. Things I can't quite come to a conclusion myself, because I honestly don't have a rational explanation. I've heard other stories from fellow rangers about them finding wild indigenous people, and I'm not talking like tribes of New Guinea. I'm talking like large humanoid people, covered in hair. And before you go the route of Bigfoot or Sasquatch, know that I don't think it's very possible. Not in these areas of woods. Except these were tribesmen, wild people. There was even a segment of time, I want to say around 5 weeks, where the entire park was shut down for an indefinite amount of time. A choice made by our higher-ups, because apparently, about 4 or 5 people disappeared simultaneously, all around the same patch of a few days. They were never found, nor any article of clothing or any trace of them was ever discovered. And believe me, we searched high and low. I was well a part of that search expedition, and we found nothing. I've heard of other search expeditions where nothing came up, but this was my own personal expedition where I found no trace of them, which is highly unusual. Having been a part of many, there's usually always at least something that you find. Clothing, a body, remains, something. But I just can't imagine 4 to 5 people, an entire group, missing at the same time, as if they had just disappeared off the face of the planet. Things like that will keep you up at night, and make virtually zero sense as to what happened. I still dream about it sometimes, wondering where they could have gone, how they could have gotten away when they did, and where are they, if ever are they going to come back. Then, you think of the obvious. They obviously died of exposure, or perhaps found a cave somewhere and hid down in it. But when your own search dogs can't even get a scent, or they find the scent and it just abruptly ends, and then your dogs start acting weird, there's just something up. Something I don't like, and I'm not exactly quite sure what it is or what it could be. In my opinion, hands down the scariest thing I've ever heard of or seen is apparently a grizzly bear being found dead, ripped in half from the waist down, or the waist up, whichever way you prefer it. Kind of like a glass of water half empty, half full kind of deal. Something, which I don't know what does this in the wild, would not only attack a grizzly bear, but have the sheer strength to rip it in half. Not cutting, not using a tool, not sawing, none of that. Sheerly ripping this creature in half. That alone is enough to make you want to quit your job. And this grizzly bear wasn't a juvenile or an adolescent or a young pup. We're talking a fully grown adult male grizzly bear. When this bear's body was discovered, it was near a river and was freshly killed, most likely within the last 48 hours of finding it. Decay and rot had already started to set in, but it's still a very disturbing find, even for the experienced ranger. It's stories like that, along with the others that I've shared with you, that make me honestly want to stay out of this career field. And since COVID, I've not been involved. And to be honest with you, when things supposedly start back up, I think I'm going to pursue a different line of work. This just isn't keeping its flair like it used to for me. Many years ago, I had the fortunate experience as working on a ranger for 7 years at the Mammoth Cave National Park. It's also the country's largest cave system, and having generated tons of paranormal reportings, it's not surprising when you get a call that there might be screaming or somebody submerged deep in the caverns. After all, there is well more than 400 miles worth of tunnels and passages, all deep into the earth. There have also been other reports of rangers going in there after people, supposedly screaming and dying themselves, never to be seen again. I've heard of rangers even going into some of these cave systems to go after people for expeditions, and never being seen again, while some report back being chased by a large unidentified predator or animal. Others have even reported seeing ghastly figures, red glowing eyes, or felt ominous, terrifying feelings, being watched, being stalked, or the worst one yet, being hunted. And unfortunately, the calls do not stop coming in. I can't tell you on a personal account how many radio calls I'd received about supposed missing persons coming from the cavern systems, or that other rangers would be by, and people and campers would be complaining about screaming coming from the cave systems, as if somebody was stuck in there and couldn't find their way out. Well, you bet it's our job to go investigate, to make sure nobody's hurt. After all, there have been legitimate cases of people getting lost and trapped in there, and we've had legitimate cases where we've actually had to go and rescue them. On the contrary, though, there are those cases where we do receive calls, and we go, and there's no trace of anybody, nor sign of where the apparent screaming or noise was heard. Only ominous, evil feelings. And this isn't just you creeping yourself out or getting spooked because you're in a dark cave. I'm talking almost an electrical feeling in the air, a feeling in the pit of your stomach that tells you you are in innate danger and that you need to leave, or that something is watching you, observing you the way a cat observes a mouse right before it's about to pounce. This danger that makes the hair on the back of your neck and your forearms stand straight up. I've even talked to some of my other fellow colleagues. None of us enjoy those calls, but as the job entails, we must answer the call of duty when called. Some of the older rangers of the area truly believe there are large species of unknown animals living down in the subterranean tunnels. Me, I can't exactly say that I believe. Although I've felt the presence, I felt the ominous feelings, but I've not seen anything. Some of the older, more retired rangers have talked about seeing these beings, and that they go and traverse throughout the tunnels and go in and out of the cave systems into the forests at nighttime. They describe them all which way, from hideous reptilian-like beings to large, hairy humanoid ape creatures and everything in between. With how crazy everything is in the world right now, I guess I wouldn't put it past reality to pull that kind of trump card, no pun intended. And while the cave system has active tours and is deemed supposedly safe on many accounts, as a ranger and as somebody that works around it often, I would never step foot in there on my recreational free time. I've just dealt with it too much. It's not something I'm particularly interested in, and as a professional and friendly warning, I suggest you don't either. I just can't deem it safe. There's already been 2 missing person reports in the last year, just from that cave alone, and even more from the years prior, all following the same pattern. They disappear, no trace. When the expeditions start up, their scent is led to these cavern entrances, where the dogs won't go in any further, which I've never seen that in a search and rescue dog before, where they utterly refuse to go in any further, no matter what the circumstance or environment. It's almost as either they feel danger themselves, or the scent trail stops, and they refuse to go in any further. Something is up, and although many of us know, I feel like we're not allowed to talk about it. So, thank you so much for being a way that I can vent my struggles and stresses, and then I can actually type all this out and send it in. You wouldn't believe how many of us all feel the same way. We all see and know the same things, but due to our job, legalities, and other things, we can't say anything. We're not allowed to. But as a person to person, I would like to give you an extended warning that these parks, these national park systems, aren't all what they're cracked up to be. They're not so safe and pretty like they're painted to be. There's more things and people going missing than you could ever imagine. You wouldn't believe how much of it is kept hush-hush. And I feel there's a good reason for that. Park reputation. If the general public knew half the things that went on, or half of the missing persons that happened, well, you would probably be willing to spend a lot less money into the parks and recreation system. It's just common sense. So, if you keep the public in the dark about this, it's much easier to keep revenue flowing, and systems and structures can be maintained more easily and kept in place. After all, money is what makes the world go round, and this is no different. I hope these sets of stories find you well, and I hope you take caution. If you enjoy going into these cave systems, just be extremely careful, and always bring protective gear, plenty of lights, and never, never forget a weapon. Hey, what lurks beneath? So, even though I don't have my own stories to share with you, a lot of my extended family serves in the forest industry, and they've all shared with me some very terrifying, bizarre, and weird search and rescue stories. I've collected a handful of them, and I thought it would be fun to share them with you. You'll find these scary and interesting. I see that you already have a huge playlist of park ranger stories. While I can't actually verify any of them are true, I can stand and say a lot of these are from my family's own personal experience, since at least 3 or more of them are serving or have served in the industry for quite some time. Starting with my great-grandfather, who served for about 19 or so years before passing away due to an unexpected automobile accident. At the time, he was one of the main leaders of the search and rescue expeditions, and while many of the expeditions turned out normal, and they actually found survivors, there were a few times they found things that didn't quite fit this realm of normalcy. For example, one time, a woman had been reported missing. They found her about 9 miles outside of where she was last seen, except when they found her, they only found her lower half, exactly from her waist down to her feet. Everything left intact. Shoes on, pants on, everything was as normal. But she was cut in half, it appeared, by something surgical, is what they described. Blood had been clotted and coagulated. There was no extra mess, no guts, nothing. It's as if she had been taken and surgically cut in half with a laser, they said. Although the wound never appeared to be burnt or singed in any way, they found it weird that there was no bleeding out or any such sort. They never found her upper half, and again, no sign of roughhousing, no sign of foul play. Her pants were never stained with blood or ripped. It's as if she just fell in half, and her upper half just disappeared. What's weird is they found her up against the base of a small mountain, out in the middle of nowhere. She had been there for probably 2 to 3 days, and another very weird trait is that there had been no onset of putrefaction or death. There was no stench, nor were there any signs of bacteria growing on her that would indicate the buildup of gases or the start of decomposition. This also happened again about 2 years later when they found a young man who was about 15 years old who had died under mysterious circumstances. He was last seen around a trail, disappeared. They found him 3 days later, stripped completely naked, hurdled and huddled by a rock, having died due to exposure. Only thing is, the same concept. There was no onset of putrefaction or decomposition, and he wasn't mummified or frozen. His body was actually around 60 degrees temperature. There's no quite explanation for what happened. They're not sure if he got lost, ripped off his clothes, and froze to death. Either way, just strange things. And the last story from my great-grandfather. This older man had also turned up missing. We're talking old, like 70, 80 years old. I don't exactly recollect if he was senile or not, but either way, he had gone missing. Well, search and rescue continued to look for up to 5 or 6 days, if I'm recalling correctly. Well, they never found a trace of him, but they found all of his clothes, his long johns, his underwear, his shirt, his pants, everything, in a pile, tattered and ripped up. No dirt, no blood, no signs of anything other than his clothes had just been clearly taken off and ripped up, by hand it appeared. Nobody's exactly sure what happened. They were searching for prints or any other evidence, and none had been found. The odd thing about this one was, all of his tattered clothes were found in a neat pile in the middle of a small clearing, about 7 miles from where he was found, north over a large ridge and through a small mountain and dense forest, somewhere he never would be able to get to by himself. Just strange things like that make you think and stay up at night, wondering, what if? Now, moving down the family line, my grandfather also served in honor of his father. He too had bizarre and similar circumstances to experience. While he never led search and rescue expeditions or found people's lower halves missing, what he did find or experience was equally disturbing. On several accounts, as he was doing his rounds, he would always claim that he felt like he was being stalked or hunted by something or by multiple things, if that makes any sense to you at all. He said there were certain parts of the park and the forest that he just could not go into, because this strong, overwhelming feeling and sensation of utter and complete doom. On other such occasions, he had had rocks pelted at him, logs thrown in his direction from downhill. Things like that. Screaming, wood knocking, all sorts of bizarre stuff he couldn't rationalize, and his scariest sighting being as he was driving, on his left, in a clearing, he saw these 2 large black figures walking off in the distance on a hill, right along the tree line. He pulled out his binoculars and looked, and he told me he could never make out details because they were so dark, so incredibly black, but assumed that they had dark fur from head to toe, and that they were walking like large giant men. 2 of them following, all the way riding the tree line, to where when they reached the end, they casually walked in the woods. I believe at this time, this was before Bigfoot, so a sighting like this didn't really have any answers, to my knowledge. Either way, it freaked him out, and by far, the most disturbing is when an incident happened very close to the main base, or the main area of a park. I don't really know what they call it. Home base, the main office, so excuse me for my incorrect terminology. But apparently, a man had had his arm ripped off, and luckily was found before he ultimately bled out. How he was found in time, I'm not exactly sure, but from what I understand is he was close enough that he was luckily discovered by other colleagues. Well, he was unconscious already due to blood loss, and if I'm recalling correctly, nearly died. But once he got blood in him, and they were able to resuscitate him, he claimed that he was attacked by what he calls a large bear man, and he said that this bear man tried to attack him, grabbed him, and pulled his arm off, and said that this bear man had such great strength that for it was like ripping up a piece of paper. Effortless. The only details he can give is that it was tall, covered in hair, had really big hands and feet, and a very ugly, scary-looking face. That's all the details my grandfather was able to extract from the man. He ended up living, but that's about as far as I know of that story. This all took place in the 60s and 70s from what I can recall. Then, One of my cousins also pursued the park ranger industry, and he too had his own fair share of weird, bizarre, disturbing experiences. Now, my cousin has had the most experiences, in my opinion, or at least has had the most amount of stories to share. And even though he didn't deal with quite the things my grandfather and great-grandfather dealt with, his own experiences are just as equally disturbing as the other two. His, though, involve a whole different realm of seeing lights, hearing strange noises, feeling sensations, and other such things. And these have also occurred over the course of years. One experience that he recalls to me that's always shaken him is when they were in the middle of doing a search and rescue expedition during the nighttime. The small team he was working with was equipped with lots of lighting gear, flashlights, headlamps, extra batteries, things professionals would use to find their way around in the dark, with always bringing up backups. Well, instantaneously, everybody's flashlights, headlamps, just exploded. I'm talking glass and plastic shattering, and the lights going out. Nobody had nothing. They were stranded there in the dark. This all happened instantaneously. Even in the dark, as they were able to fumble around and pull out the backup batteries with what little moonlight they had, all the batteries were dead, including the tons of backup ones they had. This led to them having to stumble around and find their way back about 2 miles into the dark, which was tougher than you might think. Something he has no explanation for, since all of it happened in unison. He believes that it was some sort of magnetic wave, but what could possibly hit them and his team to make that happen? He's not quite sure. Other times when he's been by himself, he'll hear this incredibly loud humming noise, crescendo more and more in volume, and then finally just stop, instantly, as if it never happened. He equates the humming noise to asking me if I've ever been around a loud generator or an air conditioner, just a really loud noise. That's the best way he described it to me personally. He said it sounded like a generator, and it kind of had that electrical humming wire noise. He said it was without a doubt some sort of machinery, but couldn't quite place his finger on it. He said there's no reason that he should have been hearing that, out in the middle of the forest. There's no buildings or electrical wiring or machinery anywhere around, so he has no idea what to equate that to. Several other of his park ranger friends have also heard the same noise, randomly, throughout different times of day, in different locations, all across the park, on search expeditions and on not. He's also reported seeing strange flashes of light in the middle of the woods, mainly during evening, dusk, night, and the very early morning hours, just as the sun is setting or rising, or completely dark. It's like a camera flash, is the way he describes it, but much, much more brighter and stronger in intensity, and only lasts a split second. He has no explanation for that one either. It's almost an unnatural brightness, is what he described it. There's no camera flash in the world that has that amount of power or intensity. Think of like a really high-end spotlight, and have it flash and fill up an entire area for just a split second. He said that's what he sees, and while he hasn't exactly experienced this next one, many of his colleagues have. They've been out in the woods, and they hear their names being whispered by strange, distorted voices. They can't really pinpoint where the voices are coming from, because they claim, all of them do, that the voices appear to be all around them, above, below, far and close by. And it's not just one voice, it's a series of voices, all different tones, volumes, and pitches, all distorted sounding, whispering their name. This has happened multiple times, and has really, really creeped my cousin out. Even though it never happened to him, he says he has no explanation for any of these things, so that about covers that. I hope you enjoyed what I've shared with you today, and I'll talk to them more, and see if I can't dig up any more stories from either of them. My great-grandfather passed a long time ago, but my grandfather, even though he's still alive and kicking, I'm sure still has a couple stories left. And my cousin, who isn't in the industry anymore, I'm sure still has some stories as well. Parts of my other family are currently serving in the industry too, but as far as I know, they don't have any stories to share with me, that I'm aware of, but I'll go prodding around and see what I can't dig up. After all, it doesn't hurt. Anyhow, I hope you've enjoyed these stories, and just know that if you know anybody that does serve in the industry, I guarantee that they've had their fair share of strange happenings. Nothing will end your career as a park ranger faster than failing to respond appropriately to a fire. And, often enough, they don't care if you're caught in it, time or not. The fact that there was a fire and you were nearby can be grounds for dismissal if your superiors are in a foul enough mood. It was, after all, the dry season at the park that I serve at. We were hearing warnings almost daily at how conditions were perfect for a massive conflagration. All of us were on edge at the time, especially me. I was at the point that I was having nightmares about the entire place catching fire, and then it being blamed on me. I almost began having heart palpitations when I saw legitimate fires that were properly contained and cared for. I was making my rounds one afternoon on a day when the park was all but completely empty. So, I pulled up to a spot that had been clearly made to have a barbecue pit. There was a fire in the pit, and it was extending well beyond the stone circle. Nobody was around. The adrenaline that I felt in that moment was terrifying. I was out of the squad car in a heartbeat, charging over to see what I could do to contain the fire, which, as of yet, had not gotten out of hand. As soon as I was standing over the stone circle, though, the fire was gone. This daunted me for only a half second. I then looked around, and I saw that the fire had somehow moved from the fire pit to the prairie grass that the picnic site was carved out of. I began panicking. I may or may not have had a slight bowel movement along with it. I ran in circles for about a half a minute before I made a mad dash at the flames to try and stomp them out. And then the flames weren't there anymore. They were further away, at the edge of the forest that bordered the prairie grass. I checked myself for signs that I wasn't having a stroke or a heart attack. I looked at the immediate area that I was standing in. No sign of having been fire, no burnt grass, ashes, smell of smoke, or any other sign. I gazed at the fire for a moment from where I stood, and it looked every bit like a real fire. I could see the smoke. I could even hear the crackling of the flames. My panic was subsiding under the strangeness of the whole situation, and I marched towards the flames and kept my eyes on them. When I was roughly 15 paces away, they disappeared. When I arrived at the spot, I could see the fire much deeper in the forest. I then felt a paranoia that defied description, but I didn't dare turn my back, so I chased it wherever the fire would disappear and reappear. It was leading me in a straight line, a single direction. I arrived at the remains of a campsite that had been set up to remain hidden. It was located in tall brush, behind a bunch of very thick, dense shrubbery, and even sharp thorns. The difficulty of moving through it made me want to turn back, but it was one of those things where I had come this far. There was no use in turning back now. I began examining the campsite, and I found things that were more terrifying than the phantom fire I was experiencing. A blue tarp full of surgical instruments that had been buried. After looking at them closer, they were stained with old blood. This shook me. I knew there was something else nearby that I did not want to find, but I did. Also, wrapped up in another separate tarp and buried in a shallow grave were two bodies. It was hard to tell who or what they were, because the bodies had been partially burned. My guess was that whoever tried to dispose of them by burning them found out that it wasn't as easy as they thought it could be, so they wrapped them up and tried to bury them hastily. After the police got involved, and forensics had their way, they determined it was a boy who had been kidnapped from an hour away, and a girl, also from about 3 hours away. The two victims had no ties to each other, which adds to the sickening twist to the entire thing. Just wanted to give you my 2 cents, since I used to be a ranger. I have no idea what happened because there was a discovery to the aftermath. Let me explain. I was having a coffee break near one of the pavilions in my park, being entirely by myself, or so I thought at the time. I jumped when an older woman tapped on the glass of my driver's side door. After rolling it down and asking her if there's anything I could do to help, she just stared at me blankly, wondering if she was okay. I began to open my door to step out and help her, and she collapsed right there on the ground. I freaked, began doing CPR. The center of her shirt had been torn off. All there was a hole in her ribcage, where her heart appeared to have been removed. I radioed the whole thing in. People showed up to take care of the body and investigate. That one actually was a huge investigation, and I've never heard another word about it. I've been told to be quiet about it, and people aren't really speaking about it in my field and higher-ups. It doesn't even make sense, and I know it's a really strange, bizarre story to happen. I don't even really know how to explain it, but for whatever reason in this job field, it appears that we run into all sorts of stuff that just doesn't make sense. I'm not sure if you're aware of all the bizarre and strange happenings of things that go on in the Forest Service industry. It's not exactly the most entertaining job in the world, and has many slower moments throughout the day. But there are some times that you just get chilled to the bone. A perfect example of this is back in my early 20s when I was interning for the first few years. We had a very interesting situation. Before I go any further, my beliefs are pretty firm. That is, I don't really believe in much. Anything like Bigfoot, fairies, monsters under the bed. I don't believe in any of that stuff. But this job has made me question things that I normally shouldn't question. At the time, I had been working in my position for around 7 months when we got a call about campers complaining, frantic and hysteric. They said something about a giant ape breaking through their camp and stealing one of their friends. Naturally, we showed up there, tried to calm them down, but they were in complete hysterics. Well, police got involved, and it turned into a full investigation, and we, including me, was a part of a full-on search and rescue for the quote-unquote missing persons, which was a young girl in her late teens that apparently this large gorilla took, or so they described. Now, when they mentioned that, my first thought was Bigfoot, but I don't really believe in that, so I kind of just chalked it up to maybe they had gotten too drunk and partied the night before, and perhaps she wandered off and got lost. But after spending some time with the campers, they were pretty clean and sober. No drugs, no alcohol, just a couple of good kids my age, just partying and enjoying themselves up in the woods. And when I say partying, I'm not talking drugs and alcohol. I'm talking a double date. They were just enjoying their time together, hiking, and being out in nature alone. Their story was that they were camping quietly, and in the middle of the night, one of these large gorilla creatures came to their tent, thrashed around. When they went to go see what was going on, this creature grabbed a hold of the youngest girl of the group, took her, and ran off with her. Now, I don't know exactly what that looks like. This is just their reiteration to us, the Rangers, of what happened. Keep in mind, their body language, complete and total fear, everything was showing us they were in complete and total terror. There's no way they were making this up. If they were the world's best actors and actresses. So, like I said, the police came, took statements, got heavily involved, and a search and rescue party began for a few days. Well, unfortunately, we found no trace of the missing girl, nor could our dogs even get a scent trail. But we found a piece of her tattered clothing about 4 miles away from their camp location, in the complete opposite direction of the park, deeper in the woods, where it's pretty thick and there aren't even any trails around. It was a piece of her tattered clothing matched via DNA. We have no other conclusive evidence besides that. So, I'm not sure if my hypothesis of her getting drunk and wandering off really matched up at this point once I found that out. After some time, I can't remember exactly at what point we stopped, but the search was given up on, and she was marked as missing and never found. To be honest, that's a case that still sits in my mind a lot. I still wonder what happened to her, and where she went, if anything. Or did something really come and take her? This strange gorilla creature they claim to have saw that terrorized and rampaged through their camp. While the case is very disturbing in its own right, due to the situation in the story, it's just one of many people like us in the Forest Service have to deal with, more than we'd like to. I've been wanting to write you in for a while and tell you my story, the one that stands out to me the most, of a very creepy situation that happened when I was serving as a ranger many, many years back. I'd say roughly 7 or 8 now. This takes us back to about summer of 2013. I won't tell you the state or the park. I prefer to keep that private. I don't want any connections to my name to this in any way. After all, you never know with the internet. But I can say it's in the Midwestern area of the United States, closer to the Great Lakes. But that's as much as I'll release. There was talk at the time of my colleagues finding nooses around the park, all around, not just one. Thankfully, they were empty, but they all appeared to be made from the same rope, tied the exact same way, and it appeared to be that somebody had made a multitude of these things and gone around and hung them up all throughout the park. I thought the whole thing was weird, but they were taken down shortly thereafter. Then a few more months passed, and we got into very, very late summer, late August, early September. That's when I began hearing talks about it. I thought my colleagues were just joking, pulling my leg, thinking that whole thing again, even though I did believe them back in the spring when they were seeing it. But this sudden revival of these nooses, it was very, very off-putting. That is, until I found them myself. I found about 7 of them, all in different areas of the parks, and the most disturbing, places that people can't even get to easily. Places that are far off trail, several miles. Just strange stuff. When we compared many of the nooses side by side, they were the exact same rope material, tied the exact same way, and were even the exact same length. Nobody, and I repeat this strongly, nobody was found hanging in them. These were all just empty nooses. But why were they set up on random branches, all throughout the park, places where we had nobody going to? None of it really made sense. And even still, thinking back about all of this, it still makes me wonder, who set those up, and why? As a park ranger, I have seen a lot of odd things in my time. We get people that come out here for all sorts of reasons, especially in the camping area when it's off season. I've stumbled across all sorts of weird stuff, but so long as that weird stuff is legal and consensual, if you get my drift, then that's up to them. No judgment. Most of them can't even look you in the eye the next morning, and we just have a small chuckle about that. As I said, if you are consenting adults, it's your own business. But one time, I came across something that ended up being a police investigation. You see, I was out and about, performing one of the last evening patrols before heading home for the night. We had 3 tents booked in that night, and it was getting towards winter when the camping area would be closed. 2 couples had appeared, and 1 family with a mother, dad, and 2 small babies. The tents were fairly spaced out, and just before midnight, everything was quiet. I had just finished up, heading back to the office to sign off, when I saw a young girl, probably no older than 18, run past me. She was just in her underwear, and from the quick flash I saw of her face before running off to the trees, she was terrified, all wide-eyed and mouth ready to scream. Immediately, I turned around, showing my flashlight in the direction she'd ran off to. There was nothing. I headed that way and looked all around, calling out even. Nothing. I recalled the 3 ladies that were booked into the campsite. They were all older. The mom was likely in her later 30s, and the 2 women in the couples were around their mid-20s, I would think. There was no good reason for a young girl to be running around in the dead of night when it was freezing cold. So, I went through protocol and alerted colleagues and police. They headed out and conducted a more thorough search, woke the campers who were not happy that the babies had been disturbed, but there was no trace. Literally no trace. I'm talking 0 footprints where I'd seen her. No apparent way in or out that showed any evidence somebody had even ran through here. And no reports of missing teen girls or bodies showing up. I was relieved, but at the same time, not exactly sure what I saw. It did leave the question of what the hell did I see, or did I possibly hallucinate it? I guess time will tell. A couple of years ago, I was sat, filing out some paperwork in the office, when a call comes in on the radio, telling me I think I'd better get down here ASAP. I just remember thinking that somehow they must have known I just sat down for a minute with a fresh pot of coffee. But a colleague calls through something like that. You better go check it out. I'm a ranger out in SoCal, and we have a massive expanse of parkland that we look after. So, after jumping in the truck and heading off to the area, one of the rangers had also been checking in on to see what we got. We have an official camping area out here, which is super busy and is ran and looked at and after by a separate team. We don't tend to get involved with that much, but we do, however, find the occasional off-site camper in the woods that we have to remove for their own safety. People, or idiots, don't seem to realize that there is a reason why there is a safe campsite, and although you can hike through designated areas, there is plenty of wildlife out there that would very much like you for an appetizer. So I pull up the truck to the spot my colleague is waiting, and my heart sinks when I see the tents. I was asked if I looked inside, and I can now see my colleague turning a little green. He told me I better take a look. I just remember thinking how bad it could possibly be. I mean, the tent, from the outside at least, hardly even looked disturbed. There were no apparent rips in the material, or obvious signs of any animal activity, let alone violent activity or struggle. But as soon as I opened the zipper, the smell hit me like a hammer to my face. Blood, and a lot of it. But that's it. No body, no belongings, not even a sleeping bag. Nothing. Just a tent full of blood. We had the police come, and they did their thing. Did a massive search of the area, and although how anything would have survived that much blood loss, I don't know. But where was the body? That site was a potential homicide location. There was also no blood trails outside of the tent, no footprints, tire marks, or anything other than from us. Speculation was that the body was killed in that tent and then drug off. But once again, there were no markings or indications in the soil or ground below us to show any of that. The cops let us know a while later that after doing tests, it was indeed human blood, but having no match whatsoever on the system to who it belonged to. So, that's another park ranger tale. We'll never know what the hell happened. I was working as a ranger this one time when I heard something pretty weird from one of the campers. It was low season, and we only had a few bookings. One, a group of Boy Scouts and their 2 leaders who were both middle-aged moms. 2, a very small church group, all female. And 3, 2 college girls who had been doing some sort of nature photography shoot and research, it appeared. So, a lot of females aside from a small group of young Boy Scouts. There were around 5 of them, and I'd say they were all preteen. And that's important to note for the story. You see, in the morning, while the scouts were cooking their breakfast, and the church ladies were doing their prayer circle, one of the college girls came storming over to the office, making and filing a complaint. She said that there had been a man outside their tent during the night. They knew it was a man, as he mumbled a couple of things and laughed. He'd had apparently a very deep voice. She said he was drunk, and that he had urinated on the side of the tent. Again, not only from the voice, but the height of where the urine had hit the tent. They known it was a guy, and not one of the little boys. Sure enough, I headed over to their tent at the location they said it happened. And sure enough, there was a strong smell of human urine. There were also 3 empty beer cans on the floor, and multiple cigarette butts. No one on that site claimed to have brought any alcohol with them, and none of them seemed like secret drinkers, and there had been no sight or smell of tobacco. Thing is, our campsite is miles away from anywhere. You would have to drive to get here, and there were no obvious signs of anybody else coming onto or through the site. It was enough to freak everybody out, and they all packed up and left. Can't say I blame them. We kept watch overnight for the next week or so, but never saw anything, and never had any more complaints. Maybe the girls just made the whole thing up. I don't know. It didn't feel like it though. And between the beer cans, cigarettes, and urine smell, it seems like a lot to waste your time on, and a lot of a story to build up. For what? Sometimes, some of the scariest things don't necessarily have to be a torn up body, or tons of blood. They just have to be unexplained. So, I work for the forestry department, and I often travel around, conducting various bits of research. I've gotten to travel far and wide, often ending up in the most remote, and often beautiful places that would be extremely unlikely to see your average Joe ever go to. Unless, like me, it was something to do with their job. Therefore, when you find something at one of these spots that has very obviously been left by a person, there is absolutely no rhyme or reason for it. You can't help but jump to nefarious conclusions. So, when you're out in the middle of absolutely nowhere, up in the ass end of Canada, with nothing around for miles, and you find a bed, it's kind of weird, if not downright unnerving. And I want to be clear, I don't mean like some leaves and twigs, something somebody had created as a bed for themselves. I mean an actual single wooden bed, complete with rotten, moldy mattresses. Multiple mattresses. Can you think of a singular reason why that would be there? There are no houses or any sort of building structures that used to be or are still there for miles and miles. In fact, The nearest road, I believe, is about 46 miles away, or in Canadian, 46 kilometers. There were no recent tracks except mine, although from the state of it, it did seem like it had been there for a very long time. It seemed like a very unusual place, just to dump a bed you didn't want anymore. And also, why? Who would haul a bed all the way out here? I ended up alerting the cops, wondering if maybe it had been used for a crime and dumped out here, since it was unlikely anybody would ever find it. Or maybe this was some kind of gang kill location. It seemed rather implausible, and thankfully, I couldn't see any obvious stains on the bed or around it, but who knew? I've never heard back about it, so I guess it wasn't the missing puzzle piece in some nationwide serial killer hunt. But I still can't think of a single good reason why it would have been there. One of the scariest things that has ever happened to me occurred while I had to take a bunch of kids from the local church group camping. I was only around 18 at the time, and one of the youth leaders of the group, mainly because it was going to look good on my college manuscript. There was around 10 little kids. Me and another youth leader, we'll call her Tammy, and then 2 adults, Mr. and Mrs. Love. That really was their name. They ran the Sunday school, and this was an overnight treat for the kids, who were all pretty young. I want to say around 8 to 11. We did all the usual camp stuff until it got to the evening. While roasting s'mores, one of the kids asked for a ghost story, but Mr. Love said he wasn't going to scare them. I guess the Bible is scary enough. But to make up for no spooky stuff, he would allow a quick game of manhunt in the dark, as long as they all stuck 2 in and around the tents and the first row of trees if he blew the whistle. They all came straight back, and whether they'd been found or not, Mr. and Mrs. Love and 2 of the kids would be seekers, and Tammy and I would hide along with the rest of the kids. I figured since I wasn't 10, I could bend the rules ever so slightly. I ran back a bit further into the trees. I planned to sneak out when I thought I was close to being the last to be found. Feeling pretty smug, as it was really dark back here, and there was no way I'd be found until I sprang out. It was super quiet, as all the kids were desperately trying not to give away their hiding spot. It became really obvious when I heard this sort of banging noise behind me as it amplified, all throughout the trees. I just remember thinking, I'm going to be given away by a raccoon or something, or a possum. There was some rustling, and then all of a sudden, I was blinded as the thing making the noise flipped on a light. I don't think I've ever been so terrified or screamed so loud in my life. There was a guy who stood behind me, only I couldn't see his face properly, like he had a stocking over it, kind of like how you see in the movies about bank robbers. As soon as I screamed and saw him, he ran. I just stood there screaming until Mr. Love suddenly appeared from the other side and grabbed hold of me, asking what had happened. Was I hurt? He took me back to camp at that point, as I could just speak. I was so scared. When we got there, and this had all taken just a few moments, everybody was back. I told them what I'd seen, and all the kids began crying. The adults knew me well enough to know there was no way I would make something like this up. So, Mrs. Love called the cops on her cell phone, while Mr. Love got everybody to huddle together and put all of our flashlights on. The police showed up and checked out the area. Of course, it was super hard to see anything in the dark, but they checked pretty thoroughly, and I even showed them the exact spot that I had seen the mysterious man. There was no trace of him or anybody else, and they ended up helping to drive all the kids home, as really nobody wanted to spend the night. The next morning, they went back again just to check for any evidence in the daylight. Now, they were able to see a ton of weird carvings that had been very recently cut into the trees, and several bullets and other sharp objects found on the floor near to where I had apparently been standing. Had I possibly disturbed a would-be mass murderer? Those are one of the things that will haunt me forever, knowing that I could have been killed. I was taking a breather from my usual rounds of the park. My day was predictable enough. I rolled around the paved roads in the park, looking for anything suspicious or illegal. Ended up just waving to everybody and stopping for a dozen coffee breaks like this one. I poured me a cup right up to the brim, and it was still very hot, piping billows of steam to the cold air. Well, that coffee ended up in my lap. It wasn't just a little jolt. It was the entire cup, to the point that I thought I had been sterilized. If you've ever spilt hot coffee on your lap or your groin, you'll probably know and feel what I'm talking about. Somebody had ran past my cruiser window and yelled as loud as possible, scaring me half to death, causing the scalding spill. I didn't get a good look at who did it, but, judging by the fits of giggling, it had to have been a small child. They ran into some tall grass, and all I saw was the grass folding in behind them. I appreciate kids, and I try not to leave them with the impression that the man is going to come and get them at the moment they step out of line. But that coffee, it hurt me pretty bad, and I was just mad enough to go looking to deliver a little 5-minute lecture. So, I took to chasing the kid, and it wasn't hard to do. As much giggling as they were seized with. Too funny for their own good, apparently. Despite how easy it was to stay on their trail, the kid managed to stay ahead of me by several paces. Quite an impressive feat, since I considered myself very much so in shape, and I figured I was hard to outrun. I was trying to gauge the age on this one. The grass came up to my waist, and I couldn't see any physical details of my assailant, just the movement that they made in the grass. My commands to freeze and to stop in the name of the law were soon washed away in that insane giggling. A kid that short couldn't have been older than 6 years old. But he or she was doing such a good job of staying ahead. It was embarrassing, and it didn't help my level of outrage. Now, here's where I can only report what I saw and what I think happened. I can't explain it through any rational means, and I barely believe my own words as it is, so bear with me. This kid rocketed into a thick bunch of orange trees, those messy things that drop those softball-sized green fruits. I knew right away that they were taking me onto a trail where it would be much easier to see them and catch them. The trail only ran in 2 directions, north and south, and it was mowed very regularly, so I could tell this wasn't just some random trail in the middle of the forest. 2 strange things happened though when I passed by that boundary of orange trees. First, I didn't see the kid, but the giggling was still there, and it seemed to be all around me. Second, the trail seemed to extend into the infinite. It was like that trick where you hold a mirror up to another mirror, and you've got a hallway into forever. Yeah, it was like that. And I've patrolled that trail on foot many times, and it was never that long. I felt my forehead for any sign of a fever, and the only thing I was sweating from was running. And just like that, the giggling was coming from a clear direction again, north. I chased after it, expecting to see either the kid making it or the end of the trail. But I saw neither. I stood and looked around, wondering if I wasn't just starting to totally lose my mind. It was when I slowly turned to the opposite direction that I saw something on the ground. Spattered and pretty broken up, but there was a trail of something dark on the grass and the fallen leaves. It looked like oil, but some of it had a red cast to it where the sunlight fell on it through the canopy. My heart had begun to sink, and I asked myself, now could this be blood? I jumped pretty hard at another burst of giggles coming from the thicket where the trail of stuff led off to. There I found, underneath the broad skirt of blue spruce, a patch of earth that had just been very recently disturbed. There, I found the body of a small boy that was just barely identifiable by looks alone. The real detectives found out that he had an Amber Alert out on him for well over a week, 2 towns away, which, for those that don't know, is probably at least 40 miles. My brain started filling in the blanks in my experience chasing that giggling, and my rational side didn't want to hear it. At all, as a matter of fact. Something changed inside of me that day, and not really for the better. I can't look at those trees very long anymore. In fact, I can barely get myself to ever walk that trail. Just in case I end up hearing that giggling again, I'll have a shootout with some scum on the run in a dark alley, but I don't ever want to hear that giggling again. Look, being on this job, it's not rare that you run into all sorts of weird stuff. In fact, many of the things you encounter, some civilians would determine as paranormal or even unexplained. But I guess on this job, you just learn to get used to it and brush it off your shoulders. But then you have experiences like this, where an episode that I can't really write off as anything logical. It really creeps me out and sends a chill down my spine. There's no explaining what I saw nor what I heard. If it really was his ghost, well, there's a reason that it led me to his body. Maybe his spirit wanted me to find his body. I don't know. Was he murdered? I don't know. Was he potentially kidnapped and taken here? I was never told. But again, it's just a part of the job that you have to get used to. And even now, I still don't feel like I get fully used to these things. This story of mine is why I had decided to become a park ranger. I had taken a dare to do exactly what we had been told not to do. Go deeper into the swamp after dark. We were one of the 3 families that went camping in southern Illinois, where there's less cornfields and more woodland and marshes and campgrounds. It's a pretty wonderful area, if that's your climate. And besides, not necessarily in the swamp, but there's nothing like an Illinois thunderstorm. And Indiana as well, since we do share neighboring states. The summers can get pretty brutal out here. Very hot and muggy. And if you're anywhere from the Midwest, you've probably visited these states, and you probably just know how it has its own culture. Anyway, back to my story. There were probably 6 or 7 of us kids altogether. Just enough of us to decide that we were going to get into trouble as soon as we were left unchecked. My favorite. I didn't have the greatest appetite for trouble, but I also didn't want to be stuck with the dirty looks from my friends that I'd surely get if I did not go along with them. I mean, as a kid, peer pressure is everything, and if you don't follow along, you don't want to be the sore sucker out, which is part of the reason why I made the decision to go along with. It was one of those wetlands where the trees were almost standing up on their roots, and said trees were huge and almost ancient. I bet they had been there for so long, hundreds, if not thousands of years, however old swamps are. There always seemed to be a mist that hovered wherever the water was. It would thin out at times, but never fully disappear. If you think in your head of a traditional swamp, well, you're probably not deviating too far. We were several nights into our camping trip, and the dark wetlands were alive with the voices of all kinds of unseen and terrifying things. What better way to keep things interesting than to dare everybody to go out and join everything living in the dark swamp at night? Something we were specifically told not to do. Our opportunity came soon enough. The adults thought we would listen to them when out of sight. And it was an era where it wasn't ridiculous to leave your children unsupervised at your campsite. The adults went to knock back a few drinks at the fire pit, just a few paces away where they could be less parents and more themselves. If you have kids, you'll know exactly what that's like. We got out our lanterns and plunged into the dark world that was roaring with night sounds, none of them necessarily pleasant. There wasn't any plan or purpose in motion once we acted on the dare. If there was, I had missed it long ago. I began to feel turned around, and I tried to spot my friends. Shouting would draw the attention of all of our parents. I couldn't hear anybody, and I lost sight of everything familiar. This is when I started to get scared. Being in an unfamiliar environment, with no sign of hope. If the din of the wetlands hadn't been so loud, I would have been able to hear my heart slamming against my ribcage, as the darkness and the things filling it with noise felt like they were closing in on me, teasing at my clothes, and threatening to invade them and share them with me. I can't tell you the joy that I felt when I was certain that I had spied the wavering light of a lantern, surely carried by one of my friends. I called out as quietly as I could, without possibly alerting any lumbering adult. The light began to draw near to me. I felt so much better. I had found somebody. I beckoned to whoever it was to keep coming. But then they stopped. They wouldn't speak or otherwise answer me. I began taking unsure steps towards them, and the light retreated with each step of mine, and I felt panic working its way back up into my chest. I begged them not to leave me behind, but they wouldn't listen. The faster I dared to come toward the light, the faster it backed away. Something, I don't know what, grabbed my wrist, and I was sure that I had been assaulted by a bear, and I felt free to shriek. A human hand covered my mouth, and I was looking into the face of one of my friends. She asked me what my problem was, and if I was blind, stupid, or both. I had no idea what she meant. Was she crazy? Had the swamp driven her to such acts of madness? She lifted her lantern ahead of the path that I had chosen, and the feeble rays exposed the ground as bristling with thorny vines and shrubs, the spines like daggers. I couldn't think of who would lead me into that sort of trouble. The dare itself was bad enough, but to lead me into running into my own death? My friend's lantern was just bright enough to light up the ground near where the deceiving light hovered. It was just a split second of visibility. It revealed that the light was not in a lantern, and there was nobody to do any holding. The light was simply by itself. Then it was gone. I dread to think of what would have happened if my friend hadn't seen me running headlong into peril. Was that light somebody else that didn't make it out of the swamp? Were they also deceived by some guiding light? I don't know. And to this day it still haunts me thinking about. Like maybe there's some sort of alien energy leading people astray purposefully in the swamp, to be lost and engulfed by Mother Nature forever, for their bodies and their spirits to become a part of the earth. That's my biggest fear. I had gone back to my tent, and I made every excuse I could to stay in it. To this day, I get heart palpitations at the sight of most nighttime illumination. Fireflies especially. Guess where I'm at? So, fast forward in time, and guess where I, a park ranger, is at? Yep, those campgrounds. The only thing more terrifying than what happened to me is the thought that it could happen to somebody else if I'm not around. I haven't seen the light or anything like it since, but I'll always be looking for it, and the kids that might see it. I don't want that ever happening to anybody else. As I've gotten older, I've heard more and more stories dealing with aliens and UFOs. I don't know how much about aliens and UFOs I actually believe in, but I can't refute the continuous stories that I hear from people and campers alike. Things about strange lights and sounds in the forest and the swamps, and even seeing figures walking around, glowing apparently. Very weird stuff. Things that you would expect to see on the episodes of X-Files, or even Mysteries of America. Stuff like that. Have I seen or heard any of that stuff myself? Not since what I did when I was a kid. And even then, as much as it scared me, I consider it fairly minimal because I didn't see any glowing figures or any light moving per se, or any large banging sounds happening deep in the swamp. It's always a creepy place if you think about it. I had one gentleman, about a year or so back, explain to me that he had this tall, white, nearly translucent humanoid figure chase him out of the swamp while he was exploring. He seemed pretty scared by it, and didn't come off as a druggie tripping out in the middle of the swamps. So, I'm not exactly sure. Although I had to take his story with a grain of salt, because anybody can make up anything. But, pairing that with all the other weird stories that happens around these swamps, it's weird. I'm not saying there's monsters out there, but I am saying there's things we can't explain. Lights, sounds, illusions even. And, as a ranger, I have to keep aware of those things and ensure everybody's safety, which means I have to be extra cautious being in these environments. So, partially, I'm here to tell you my story and experiences, but mostly, I wish you would wish me luck. After I retired, I took a job as a park ranger. At my age, that meant sitting in the lookout part of the lodge and drinking coffee while wearing a uniform and keeping an eye out for anything out of the ordinary. You know, scary ghosts coming up on camera, a huge fire, maybe occultism, you know. Nothing ever really happened, which was fine by me. It made my job a lot easier. I mean, who doesn't want anything to happen on their job? But there was one day where my nerves shot from 0 to 100 pretty quickly. I can remember that it was cloudy weather, so I suppose there's some room to say that my eyes might have played some tricks on me. My post sits on the second floor of a lodge that is normally open to the public. People can come and go as they please within certain hours of the day, pick up brochures, look at certain animal bones kept behind glass. You know, one of those places you take your kids when there's absolutely nothing else left for them to do. Sure, it's a great place to have small talk with strangers, but it's also a place where I have to do my work. From my vantage point, up there in the Great Bay window, I can see trouble coming from a mile away. I looked down one day when the storm clouds were gathering thick, and poking above one of the bushes was the face of a woman. A beautiful one, to be exact. She was blonde and smiling a toothy grin. And, well, she seemed to be looking straight at me. But not just at me, into me. Like she was intimately looking into my soul. It was very charming to say the least for the first few seconds, I guess. But she didn't stop staring. She turned her head this way and that, and then looked back up at me, and kept the glare and the grin. I looked around to see if maybe I just thought I was in her line of sight. There wasn't anybody else on the ground. It was just me, and just her outside. So, not knowing what else to do, I just sipped on my coffee, very nervously. I heard of strange people roaming the woods, but I didn't think any of them would be cute young blondes. I pretended to not notice her, but she wasn't hardly fazed. She'd look one way, and then another. Once in a while, she might even completely turn around, but she always ended up facing me again, and her expression wouldn't change for anything. Against my better judgment, I went down to see if I can help her. Coming around behind the bush revealed that from her neck down, there was nothing. She was hanging from an eye hook that had been bored into her head, and she was strung up by some upholstery thread tied to one of the tree branches above her. Her lips had been stapled into a grin, and her eyelids had been stapled high so that she stared wide open. I know, it's one of the most disturbing cases I've ever dealt with. I reported everything, and she's still an unsolved case to this day. I didn't feel comfortable keeping with that job, and even writing this to you feels very uncomfortable to write about. I'm not sure if you're familiar with any of David Paulides' work, but his entire book series on Missing 411 details many accounts, just like mine, or similar to mine, of finding missing persons or even dead bodies among the forest and parks, all sorts of places. This is just one of my many disturbing accounts that I've had while working at that job. And if you do intensive search and rescue, sheesh, you will find a lot worse. And I don't even want to hear half of their stories, because they're just far too depressing and gruesome. I have seen more than my fair share of oddities during my time as a ranger, and always have plenty of stories to share, in exchange for a pint down at the local pub. Of course, the tales that get the biggest round of applause are always the times that I've spotted, or sometimes a party, or sometimes a couple. Let's just say it's generally people having a good time. It takes all sorts, and I've seen it all. Trust me. And being a ranger, you see your fair share of nonsense and debauchery. However, that's all just a bit of the harmless fun. And you don't want to hear about the steamy car windows. So, I'm writing to you because I want to tell you that this has nothing to do with any of that stuff. Those are stories that you share with your mates. This one, however, won't make you laugh or shout, "Nice one." This is probably the most terrifying thing I have ever witnessed, and you are the first person I have ever told it to. So, it happened one night, a couple of years ago. Now, despite my stories of finding couples in cars and doing other things out of the woods, I don't actually do a lot of shifts in the dark. Vandalism is minimal, and it is usually too damn cold to find illegal campers. But, every so often, something happens, and the bosses think it is a good idea for one of us rangers to perform a quick patrol in the van once the sun finally goes down. It just so happened that there had been a couple of nasty and unprovoked attacks a couple of towns over. And, although police had no evidence of the Moors were linked in any way, the boss thought it would be good for the community, just to see some sort of authoritative presence. So, off I go, in the van to drive around, and report back if I see anything suspicious. Apparently, his latest victim had managed to protect herself, and had smacked him around the head before legging it. Good on her. Now, unless I happen to see a man waving a flag stating I am a rapist, I wasn't entirely sure what I was meant to be looking for. Driving around the moors at nighttime is quite enjoyable, as well as the various pint-worthy stories. You get to see your fair share of British wildlife. Creatures your average Joe would never be lucky enough to catch a glimpse of. I'm speaking of things like badgers, foxes, deer, hares, all manner of birds. And once, a long time ago, mind, a border collie that had escaped its owner and had been wandering around for days trying to find its way home. So, at first, when I saw what I supposed was a dog, I wasn't actually scared. This creature was huge, and if I hadn't had the headlights on full beam, I wouldn't have seen it, since it was black as the night. It was facing away from me, even though it appeared to be the size of a small horse. I wasn't afraid, yet. Opening my car door carefully with the engine idling, I made to step out of the van to try and get it to come over. If it was a lost pet, it was likely hungry and would come to me if it thought food might be an offer. I whistled to it, calling it over, patting my leg. Then, my poor vision of this thing became very clear. It turned to me. Now, as I said, up until now, I wasn't frightened, but then, it looked right at me. I'm not really a big fan of horror movies in really any way. They're just not my cup of tea. But when I looked into that, this dog's bright red glowing eyes, I knew it was something sent straight from hell. I'm not a religious man at all. Until that moment, I didn't even know I believed in such thing as hell. But that thing in front of me could have been right out of the pages of a Stephen King book. I stood there for a moment or two. To be honest with you, I was frozen with fear. The pure malevolence exuding from this beast was like nothing I'd ever felt before. Yet somehow, I seemed to sense that whatever reason it was there, it wasn't for me. Regaining some of my faculties, I get back into the van, never taking my eyes off of it, and then sped out of there like there was no tomorrow. I didn't even sign off a report back to base. I drove home, crawled into bed with a bottle of Bell's, and down almost half the bottle before I finally passed out, trying to let my brain process with heavy inebriation and time. Next morning, I woke up with a banging headache and the answer phone flashing like it was Blackpool illuminations. Once I managed to prise my eyes open, I listened to my messages. Police were all over the moor. They'd found the supposed rapist, and he was dead. Although, it was presumed he died from exposure due to the freezing overnight temperatures. Alongside the untreated head wound, one of the officers claimed the guy looked as if he died of fright. A look of abject horror frozen over on his face forever. I knew right then and there exactly when they'd found him, and exactly what he'd seen. My only conclusion to this story is this man and I had both seen what they call a hellhound come to Earth to claim the soul of a monster. These things are real, and there's no doubt that what I saw came from the very pits itself. Whether it was for me or somebody else, I'm not sure. But I don't think it was an accident that I happened to run into this creature, as bizarre as it was. So, if you yourself happen to run into anything strange or out of the ordinary, don't expect it to be a mistake. There's a reason for these things happening. And maybe it was putting a mark on me for a future reference. I guess I'll know soon enough. I've been a park ranger up here in Maine for a very long time. I'm sure many others who do the same job as me will give you the go-around, but I'm not going to be shy about it. I've seen all sorts of weird and wonderful things, but nothing that I would ever classify as scary or unexplained. That is, until now. Growing up, listening to Art Bell on Coast to Coast, and watching The Night Stalker, I had heard my share of alien encounters and things that go bump in the night. Whilst I love all that stuff, I didn't believe a word of it. Until now. You see, I was making a routine patrol one evening in a particularly dense wooded area up near the very top of Maine. There'd been a couple of reports filed by hikers about mutilated moose being found on the trail. It's not the most unusual thing that can happen. You wouldn't believe what some predators do to their prey. But this, well, it was kind of unusual by the animal kingdom's standards. You see, these moose had been drained of their blood. If this was an episode of CSI or some cop drama, and we were talking about humans, they'd very likely presume that this was just a dump site, and the victim had been killed elsewhere. But this was a moose. Ain't no animal predator I know of that is clever enough to pull a Dexter. In fact, there's only so many animals that even go after and target moose, which again, makes it very limited. So, patrols were up to try and see exactly what type of creature was attacking our wildlife. I'd been driving around for hours when I saw it. Now, I have to tell you, despite being an avid fan of those cryptozoology shows and the like, as I said, I didn't believe in any of it. I just simply enjoyed it for entertainment purposes, and thought it was nothing but a bunch of fan fiction. So, when I saw this thing over the ground, next to a fallen moose, let's just say I thought it must have been a coyote, or something. Maybe some sort of deformed, mutated animal. I thought maybe a large, mangy coyote, with grayish, scaly skin. Oh, and spikes going down his back. Definitely a coyote. Because, I'm telling the God's honest truth here, that was exactly what it looked like. Some sort of messed up mix between a dog and a reptile, with scaly, nasty looking skin, and real sharp lizard spines running down its back. Oh, and it had its head buried into the moose, as if it were sucking out the blood. I'm not ashamed to say that I did not get out of my truck. I just sat there, staring at this thing in front of me, trying like hell to somehow rationalize what I was seeing. Was I processing this correctly? Was I seeing some sort of illusion? Then, as I'm deep in thought, trying to process the horror before me, it turned and looked right at me. There was no way at this point now that I could pretend like it was some type of normal animal with some kind of weird mangy disease or mutation. No, sir. The head that looked at me was that of some type of reptile. It had huge bulging black eyes, razor-sharp teeth, which at the moment seemed to be dripping with blood. It didn't try to come near me, but quickly hissed at me and then shot off into the woods, like just my utter presence alone had disturbed it. I don't know how long I sat there in the truck, too damn scared to get out and look at the poor creature on the floor. I knew for sure without needing to check that it was indeed dead. Eventually, I willed myself out, one hand on my hip, just in case. I headed over to the moose, and just as I suspected, it was dead. I ain't no veterinarian, but I was willing to bet $1,000 that I knew why. 3 small holes appeared near its head, where whatever thing I looked at had seemed to drain every last bit of blood from it, and I caught it mid-heist. I dragged that poor damn beast onto the back of the truck and took her back. The so-called experts were baffled. Of course, I didn't dare tell them what I had seen, because as I said, I've watched enough of these shows over my lifetime that I don't need them to tell me. Although we never had any more unexplained moose deaths, but I swear to you right now, that reptilian-like dog creature I saw, I'm pretty convinced it was a chupacabra. And before you go off calling me fake for pulling a moose onto the back of my truck, it was still a very small adolescent moose. Not that big. I don't know exactly how the biology works with moose, if at any point they separate from their moms or how that works. But perhaps this one was pulled away from its mother, and, well, this creature had its way with it. Anyway, I'm fairly certain that I saw my first ever cryptid, and that, my friend, is a chupacabra. I know they're real, and while it seems odd to me that I've seen one of these creatures up in Maine, from everything I've heard, I would expect to see them down in like New Mexico or Arizona, so this was news to me. But I guess they're everywhere, and it just goes to show you that nowhere is truly safe. No matter if you're in the woods or even in your backyard, there's always something watching you. have no doubt that you will have heard of the Grand Canyon. I mean, hell, you might have even visited at least once or twice. Maybe on a day trip, whilst escaping the depravity of the Strip for a while. Or maybe you just enjoy the nature of things and the scenery. For me, it was a bit of both. See, I grew up in Las Vegas, and as a lot of folk do, first couple of jobs I had were in those casinos. I seen enough in my time there to fuel a lifetime of nightmares. Drunken debauchery, people screaming, all sorts of crazy stuff. I needed out, for the sake of both my physical and mental health. A complete and utter change of career. And you couldn't get much more polar opposite than the casino host to a park ranger, could you? And let me tell you, I loved the drastic change. Of course, there were stories that some of the old hands liked to try and scare us new guys with. Tales of ghosts, the disembodied thudding sounds of something in the dark, sounding like a body landing on the ground, but when nobody else was around. There'd been a few accidental deaths there over the years, same as any place with a high number of visitors. People die at Disneyland each year, so of course things are going to happen here. But see, I believe in monsters. I'd seen my fair share of them back in those hotel rooms. And they're always human, real as you or I. No matter what the others said, I knew they were just trying to spook us, throwing silly ghost stories at us, trying to get under our skin, make us uncomfortable. I wasn't the spooking kind. That's why I'm pretty sure that what I heard that night, well, it must have been one of them pranking me. It didn't matter that I was meant to be the only one on that particular rotation. One of them could have snuck in. It's really the only way I can explain it. You see, I didn't mind volunteering for the third shift, and unlike most of them, I lived alone. I ain't got a wife or kids to worry about, and I'm perfectly at ease in the dark, with only myself for company. Even patrolling in a spot where, allegedly, a father and son fell to their death nearly 100 years ago. I didn't feel any cold spots, didn't see any orbs floating about, none of that crazy stuff. Like I said, I hardly believed in any of that BS anyway, because as I've told you, my experience with monsters was dealt in the casinos and the hotels. That is, until it all changed with this god-awful scream. It was an awful wailing scream that I had never heard before. In fact, it sounded like some lady was being murdered. I rose the alarm on my radio and grabbed my gun quickly. It sent shivers down my spine, and I felt an unknown terror like I'd never felt before. It was my instincts kicking in full. I called out, asking where she was, telling her I could help her. But I was only met with the silence of the night and more darkness. Nothing. I searched and searched, and by the time my backup arrived, I began to think I'd imagined the entire thing. What luck, right? Way to feel like a fool. Until my boss appeared. He had a very solemn look upon his face, taking me into the office after dismissing the others. He proceeded to tell me the full story. You see, around 100 years ago, this man and his son did accidentally fall to their death. But, even more tragically, the wife and mother happened to see it. A few weeks later, unable to cope with her grief, she had returned and flung herself to her death, intending to join her husband and son, screaming all the way down until she hit the hard bottom. And, of course, the anniversary of her suicide. Well, lucky me, it was exactly 100 years ago to that same day. I'm not trying to sit here and convince you that I encountered the cry of the motherly ghost, but what I am trying to convince you that I heard something that I can't exactly explain. And although I want to chalk it up to my colleagues, I can't be exactly certain how they managed to do it. How they managed to match the timbre and the pitch and the volume of the scream, even imitating the fall all the way down the canyon. It was terrifying to say the least. And even though I don't consider myself a believer in ghosts, per se, it's made me reevaluate what I truly believe and what I feel is actually out there, waiting to be discovered. I'm going to keep my details and my identity pretty anonymous and vague, just for my own protection, in case, for whatever reason, the wrong person listens and hears this. I know I might be overly paranoid sounding, but you can never be too sure with sharing such sensitive information. Years back, for about 7 months, I worked as a park ranger, as well as participating in some search and rescues. It wasn't all it was cracked up to be, and in fact, I experienced some very strange things that I feel it's important to talk about. The people whom I worked with, I still have fairly good relationships with, at least most of them, even though this is well over 8-9 years ago. Before I get to anything, let me just say that before this job, I did not believe in the entire alien UFO phenomenon. I thought it was a huge hoax, just made up stuff to put on the internet for people's entertainment. But after my 7 months on the job, well, my opinion changed, and let me tell you why. We had at least 4 instances that I can recount on the top of my head, probably more if I really try to sit down and think about it. Instances of people disappearing and reappearing for a considerable amount of time that did not make sense. The first being an older lady, roughly 68 or 67, fairly good shape, hiking by herself, and just vanished. Vanished like there was no trace of her left. I do very vividly remember the search and rescue mission looking for her. The dogs would stop and start whining right on the spot that she disappeared. We could not find any trail scent. We could not find any trace of her belongings or clothes. She was heavily equipped, backpack, camping equipment and all, and very survival smart. We found nothing. About 6 weeks go by, and she's there, same trail as always, coming back the direction she came from, acting strange when people were reacting to her, saying that she had only been gone for maybe an hour at most. Apparently, she had no idea that it was now roughly 6 weeks later, and was shocked when proven on the calendar and other sources of technology that proved to her that 6 weeks did indeed pass. So what happened? Did she just walk into another dimension and come back? It doesn't make any sense. I should also add that there was nothing wrong with her. No clothing marks, no dirt. She hadn't even aged. Of course, you're not going to age in 6 weeks really, but you know what I mean. She looked exactly the same, clothing and all, as the day she disappeared. When she was taken into custody and interviewed, she said that she just hiked, went down the trail, and came back like nothing ever happened. The only major difference here is that on the day she disappeared, it was very, very sunny, and on the day she came back, there was considerable amounts of overcast. When asked about that, she simply stated that on her way back down the trail, a considerable amount of cloud coverage occurred, meaning overcast. Now, there's a lot of speculation around this story, specifically her. Some say she was abducted by aliens, as that's the only real thing that could explain the passing of time, and her not changing any shape, form, and remaining perfectly intact, just as the day she was. Compare that to other similar phenomenons around other people going missing and turning up months later, sometimes years later, in exactly the same state they were when they disappeared. Also having absolutely no knowledge of them ever disappearing in the first place, or if it is, it's very vague, like they saw a white light, or something along those lines. This lady had no idea she was ever gone. The month she disappeared was early April to around mid-May. There was also speculation that she walked into a time portal, somehow. Again, no real evidence to back that up. I thought the alien thing was a lot more plausible, and at the time, it really freaked me out, but still wasn't a nail in the coffin yet. And then it would happen again, in June. 2 small boys actually, twins, 4 years old. I'll never forget these boys, named Jacob and Isaac, both wearing white shirts and blue coveralls. Very sweet little boys. They disappeared early June. Last seen, chasing or playing tag, running around in circles around a big fir tree. Then next thing you know, they're gone. No trace of them. Same thing ensued. A large 7-day search and rescue mission found absolutely no trace of them. Parents, after about a month, were convinced they were dead, had a funeral service, they moved on with life as best they could. Then, right around Labor Day, I think it was about 3 days after to be exact, so maybe September 14th, if my dates are correct, they appeared exactly the same state they were in, and you'll never get this, running around the same fir tree they were running around when they were last seen, still playing tag, still in the exact same clean white shirt and blue coveralls, same haircut, they hadn't missed a meal, they looked perfectly healthy and content, the same day as they left, like the previous woman and other accounts. They had no idea time had even passed, and at this point, it had easily been 3 months since their disappearance. Officials, police, and their parents, nobody could explain their disappearance, what happened or how it happened. But a similar situation where the parents took their eyes off their boys for just a moment to grab something while they were cooking, and boom, gone. This one also freaked us out. We got a chance to talk to the boys, me specifically. They had no idea anything ever happened. Their account, as the best of 4-year-olds can give, is they were playing around a fir tree. Next thing you know, Mom and Dad have different clothes on, different haircuts, just basically a 4-year-old's recounting of how Mom and Dad now look a little bit different because 3 months had passed, and Dad might have a little bit of a beard, and Mom's hair might be a little bit longer or shorter. You know, the best a 4-year-old can describe. And like the lady before them, absolutely no trace of them going anywhere or having any sort of memory of where they were. Were they abducted and experimented on by aliens? I don't know. It's hard to say. But this one for me really sealed the deal. But then there would be 2 others. These 2 were also very strange. This next man, I won't mention his last name, but his first name was Martin. He was 38 years old, had apparently disappeared 3 years prior to this happening, and this would have been the beginning of October. Suddenly reappeared in the same clothing and everything he had on the day he had disappeared. I believe he had disappeared about 3.5 years earlier, although his account was a little bit different than the previous. He tells us, when he was eventually found and interviewed, that a bright light engulfed him, and for a while, he was wandering around in complete whiteness. Yes, he used the word whiteness, like a void of nothing but light and white, if that makes any sense. Although something of that description is really hard to even understand. He says during this time, he had no idea of any time passing. He also felt no feelings in his body, like hunger, sleep deprivation, thirst, bathroom, or any of that. He claims he has no idea how long he was there, but wandered aimlessly for what felt like months if not years, but in all actuality, said it was probably only 5 or 10 minutes. He claims it was almost an out-of-body experience. The next thing you know, everything goes back down in light. He described the words as it dimming down, and then he was back here, in his body, in the same clothes he wore. He was not lying on the ground unconscious. In fact, he was still very much alert. He was surprised more than anybody else that 3.5 years had fully passed, and it was now October, because when he disappeared, I believe it was March for him 3 years prior. Now, this very last one to me is by far the weirdest, and once I tell you, You'll understand why. So, we found this man about 2 weeks after Martin, and to be honest with you, if the two boys, Jacob and Isaac, hadn't sealed the deal, there's no way you could go through this case and not believe. This man, his name was Brandon. He was 46 years of age, kind of an older guy. But here's the thing. He had been gone for 7 years, disappeared without a trace. And when he was found again, in the middle of the park, just out of nowhere, he was in almost these white-like robes, kind of like robes that a priest would wear at a temple. He had a very long beard, but looked very upkept, very clean. When he was asked about who he was and his identification, he seemed to be fully aware and cognizant of everything around him, even how much time had passed, and that he knew he had been gone. But it gets much weirder than this. When he was interviewed and asked, he said he was at the park on a trail, where he was taken and also, like the other man, engulfed in a white light. He said it was there that he met beings, and according to his time frame, spent 10 years in what Brandon described, just like Martin, as a place full of light and void. He said these beings that he mentored under, he specifically used the word mentor, taught him several languages, which he didn't know before. Here's the other weird thing. They taught him full-on Chinese. I mean, he could speak it extremely fluently. After speaking to his family to make sure he's not crazy, he was never able to speak it before. So, now this man of 7 years now all of a sudden returns, wearing white priest-like robes, with a long beard, very upkept, and weirdly can speak very fluent Chinese, more than enough to actually live in that country. And on top of that, says he learned it and was taught it by these white translucent beings in this white void in which he was engulfed by a white light and brought back the same way. Unlike Martin, he knew how much time had passed, and he knew he had been gone for X amount of time. But even though he was actually missing for 7 years, he claims he was in this dimension for 10 years. Now, I know what you're thinking, that this sounds absolutely insane, and I thought the same thing too. But when you get a chance to see this firsthand, to be on these search and rescue missions and to talk to these people, there's really no way to explain this thoroughly. I was feeling like I was living in an actual episode of The X-Files. I felt like I was in some sort of alternate universe. Nothing made sense. So the only thing I could really pinpoint is that there really must be alien life, and for whatever reason is abducting people. I can't really explain why all 4 of these people had different experiences. 2 having very similar experiences, and the other 2 having very similar experiences. It doesn't really make sense to me, but I guess that doesn't matter in the long run. This kind of stuff happened, and shortly after Brandon had been found, I decided to quit. It was too much for me. I don't know how experienced park rangers or people in that service industry can handle it. I mean, it just goes beyond normalcy. With all of this said, do I really believe that UFOs or aliens had a hand in all of these things? Yes, I do. There's no other way to explain these weird abductions or lapses of time, or in Brandon's case, being taken, clothing being completely different, having a beard grown out, which, by the way, when he disappeared, was a clean-cut, clean-shaven guy. Never knew a drop of Spanish or any other language besides English. And now apparently he comes back looking like a prophet of some religion, speaking full-blooded Chinese. Nothing really makes sense. And his story, if you ever actually got the chance to sit there and listen to his 2-hour recount of it, was just incredibly strange. I was only given bits and pieces, major components of his tale, but that these strange, translucent, spiritual beings taught him multiple languages, which apparently don't exist anymore, and he would not speak them, for fear of a reason I can't remember, but said they taught him full Chinese. You just think about how crazy that is, and how much it doesn't make sense. It scared the hell out of a lot of detectives and people working on that specific case, and many of us rangers it spooked us. because you clearly can't explain something like that. This was something truly supernatural in every sense.